Was that
There
hurricane?
was we're live now, FYI. But yeah, there was a hurricane passing through the Caribbean, I think last weekend. And yeah, it was windy and rainy, but the worst of it was um, in Puerto Rico and kind of the eastern tip of the DR. So we were in the clear basically. It was cool though. I like right before it kicked off like hardcore, when it was just like, basically before the worst of it hit us, but it was still kind of crazy out, like wind and rain and shit. I went out for a run and a swim on the beach, and this like it's awesome, dude. There's nobody around, like you have the whole beach to yourself. And I love trail running or running like when it's just nasty out, because you feel like some sort of, army commando or Navy SEAL or some shit, in your mind. And and then get in the water and play around. It's like it's super rough, and I don't know. I've always loved storms and being out in them to the extent that it's possible. So it was no big deal really where I am. So
Yeah, I've
anyways,
been in a few of those. Seen
yeah,
some crazy things like the umbrella poles getting thrown and piercing tree trunks. Some pretty nutty
yeah.
stuff.
And like for a lot of people, well, in many parts of the world, I guess, these sorts of things are way more destructive than it is for like, us who live in relatively not nice houses. It's not, like normal houses, because when in a lot of the, especially tropical areas of the world, like people are living in, you know,
Shanties.
yeah, exactly. And those things just get completely decimated at storms. So I don't want to make light of how destructive it can be, but I've always just enjoyed the chaos of a good storm.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I've always enjoyed it too. But I've been out in some choppy waves before, and when one of those throws you on a bank of sand, uh, I don't know, you kind of lose its appeal for how fun it can be.
But yeah, well, I mean, it shows you kind of how risky it can be too, right? Like
Yeah,
being out in the water is a trip, because like all it takes is a wave to hit you when you're not expecting it. You gulp it back, and then you reflexively cough and suck in. And if in that suck in, it's another wave, like you could be pretty stitched up. There's no
you're in
joke out
trouble.
there. Yeah,
Oh, for sure. It's humbling though, huh? Getting slapped in the face by a big wave.
totally, totally. I mean, there's another kind of weird thing of mine, but I um I do a lot of swimming too, right? Like out in the water, and in the ocean, I'm a bit more careful with it. Like, but when I was back home in Canada for a while, I used to swim in a pond there. And if there was like it was a really windy, rainy day and the pond was super rough, and like, I used to go swim with my dad when he was available. He would be like, no, I don't want to go today. And I would prefer to swim in the crazy chop, right? Because it makes it so much more intense, right? You got to manage your breathing so much more carefully. You've got to be aware of all the waves so much more carefully, because again, like you turn to the side and you get a wave slapped in your face and you don't get that breath you needed. The margin for error is so little, and there's just something exhilarating about it, right? I mean, this is why people like doing kind of risky sports and extreme sports and shit. So
Yeah. We went surfing in Hawaii under the moonlight, and you'd have some clouds that would come and like block out the moon. And so all of a sudden you're like kind of pitch black in the
oh
sea,
man, holy
and you'd
shit.
have these big waves coming, and you just hear this roar and then just slap. And it's just like, oh, you have
That's
no
Jimbo
idea
on
what's up with it.
he just popped in. Does he know we're live? And does he know, is he
I don't think he does, but
it,
he'll be fine. Oh,
let let him know
maybe he's getting.
he's gonna be live with his face on the video as soon as he comes in.
All right, so I just messaged him on Telegram, and he's seen it.
All right.
So
Well, I'll just let him in, I guess.
it'll be
Is
good.
he, do you know if he's watching his identity?
Yeah, he said okay, so you should be good.
All right.
I'm the docs one here. I think he still wants to preserve his anonymity.
Well, his face is showing now in the video. That's what I mean.
Oh, I'm not seeing it. Well, he said okay though, so I guess
that's
he's
what
okay with
that's what I was trying to make sure of.
it.
Jimbo, can you hear me?
I can now. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, sweet.
Oh, Jimbo, what up?
I guess you don't mind that your face is showing.
Oh, no, it's all right. But
All
thank you. Thank you for asking.
Sweet. So now the whole gang is here. What's going on? How you guys doing? What do you want to talk about?
Well, don't look at me. He wrote me into this.
I have no idea. We were just kind of, you were saying who wants to come on? And I just kind of said, I will if Jimbo does. And, you know, Jimbo's like, yeah, sure. Why not?
Well, what's in scope? What's in scope? Is it like must be Bitcoin, or are we allowed to go geopolitics?
There's no fucking scope whatsoever, and whatever you want to talk
That's
about.
the best scope.
I saw a news report today. I don't know when it happened, but it was Bloomberg reporting that the Treasury is trying to staff a position called Chief Sanctions Economist. And this person would be responsible for reporting on potential likely outcomes of proposed sanctions or existing sanctions, because we do so much sanctioning that they need to specify a position just for that. It pays $150,000 a year salary, requires top secret clearance. And this person, in addition to reporting on these things, would also have like 2 staff economists to work with them. So they're also a manager. So this whole idea, anyway, that's the framing. So I'll stop there.
And they don't have to be an economist.
Oh yeah. Being trained as an economist is not required. Top secret clearance is, but having any kind of economics degree not required.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you got to wonder how many of these people either are already or will end up being just like sleeper cell Bitcoiners in these supposed positions of like regulatory fuckery. You know, because you can hire someone for a position. You can tell them their job description is whatever, to point the sanction finger wherever they want it pointed. But as we all know, like, the orange splinter in your mind can get there in many different ways. And once it gets in there, it starts changing things. And, you know, maybe at the end of the day, like, all these people will, or many of these people in these positions will be kind of transformed in that way. And I guess, I mean, maybe their only option then would be to eject from their position, and because maybe they wouldn't be able to like allow themselves to engage in certain behavior after having the orange epiphany. But I don't know. Why do you bring it up? Just another clown world job description that popped up?
I just find it hilarious. Like, they expect this person to have chief in their title, live in DC, report to the Treasury in a job where their job is to analyze the effects of sanctions on foreign governments, and get paid $150,000 a year for that, like, risk profile and responsibility. And I just find it hilarious that it's so obvious to me that it's like, this is for a puppet. This is for, you know, the cousin of a senator or something who's already got the risk profile for that kind of a job. But anyway, that's what I bring it up.
Welcome to Washington.
Yeah. Like, you're not going to get a person in that job who has any sort of integrity or like belief in actual outcomes, you know. It's just so transparent. That's why I thought it was funny. But to your point about Bitcoin, it's like, because that was my first thought, was like, well, obviously the person who takes this job is going to be targeted by foreign governments who would really like to have your report say that the sanctions are ineffective, so that the sanctions get taken away. And how are they going to pay you? Well, they can't use the banking system, right? So, but like I said, I mean, that person would just be they're either going to take the grease or they're going to be threatened. Like, that's the way that world operates. So that's why I think it's just going to be a puppet. Sorry.
No, I mean, I agree, but you're basically describing every single, you know, bureaucratic or government job in existence. I mean, they're all just puppets, and they all have to set aside their own values and all that kind of stuff and subjugate their integrity to the machine.
Everyone apart from Ron Paul.
What's that?
Everyone apart from Ron Paul.
Yeah. But I guess he's a part of the government, I guess. Is he still a congressman?
I'm not too sure, but
He's
he is the only exception
now,
that comes to mind.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's some good people in there, especially if you were an elected representative, right? That's that seems to be part of the filter, right? Because in some cases you're appealing to, people that are halfway sensible, and some good people get through. But if you're part of the quote unquote deep state or the bureaucratic machine or whatever, then you're just a cog in a wheel. And are you going to take the paycheck and the cushy job and the retirement benefits and health insurance, or are you going to stick to your principles? And 99% of people in the world today are going to do the former.
Yeah.
Yep. The joys of democracy.
Yeah. Unless they have a nice little Bitcoin stack, and as hyper Bitcoinization continues, they have more and more confidence to flip the bird to their employer and say, you know what, I'm going to do what feels more right to me.
Yeah, I would have thought that would have been the case, but then you saw in the Lummis bill that she's trying to pass off Ethereum and give them a get out of jail free ticket, essentially, well.
I'm not familiar with it. What was the details?
She was just trying to say that Ethereum's a commodity, and it's not a security, essentially, and trying to sneak that into the bill. And it's just like, that's just a weird stance for a Bitcoin politician. You would have thought that she would have tried to delineate the two and work on solely Bitcoin.
What do you think the reasoning was? Was she just trying to appeal to the two major camps and get the support from both, or what was the chatter around that, the thinking behind that decision?
Probably what you were saying there, but is she taking into account that the centralized security is it's either going to be captured by the state, and now it's kind of fighting as that's its only method of survival, and its only real purpose is to birth any sort of CBDC. So even trying to add that in there just to get this bill across the line is the pitfalls of democracy in the first place, isn't it? It's always the lesser of the evils, and trying to get across the line by force.
Is there a case to be made, and I'm totally just thinking out loud here, that lumping them in together there could be a benefit to it, because Ethereum is so captured and capturable that you could maybe some elements within the state would be they're the same thing, and now we kind of have some degree of regulatory oversight or control, not realizing that they're very different. Would it pacify them for a period of time, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah, it could be seen as trying to buy time. I don't know, there's always these little nuances involved, but the joys of being a Bitcoiner is none of the stuff really applies.
Yeah. What was the bill? It was no cap gains under a certain spending limit, something like that. Was that the major part? And I think the
transaction limit was super low. It was $65 or something.
Right. So you can spend $65 or less without us taking a share, you peasant, basically.
Yeah. It's I was having this conversation with my stepfather a few weeks ago, and we're talking about democracy, governance, constitutional republic versus national democracy and stuff. And it was fascinating because towards the end of it, it's it's not going to be this utopia where you don't pay taxes. I was like, well, what was the Boston Tea Party? How was America founded? Was it not for those same principles? And then you look around and you're the average amount of tax, if you add them all up and then do a median of each state, is 50% or higher anyway.
Yeah. And even I was looking at this, and you guys might be able to correct me or be more specific, but I was looking at turn of the century tax rates and stuff like that. And I think, early 1900s, and I guess before, there was effectively no income taxes. And I think the rate at which it was introduced, when it was first introduced, and it might have been 7% was the maximum, and inflation adjusted, I think it was an income, not a wealth tax. Again, I have to make sure, but the inflation adjusted income was $4 million a year on which the tax was applied. So isn't that crazy? Unless you were making, so you're making $4 million a year, and then you pay 7% tax, and that was basically the only tax. And if you're a normal person making inflation adjusted, I don't know, 50 to 100K a year, I think it was like effectively zero.
Yeah.
Jimbo,
And
you
it
seem to
was
be
brought
shaking.
in
Do you guys
in
know if that's
19
accurate?
It sounds about right, if I recall correctly. It was brought in 1913, the same year as the Federal Reserve, and it was
Yeah.
introduced as a way to make sure the rich pay their share. And ironically, led us to where we are, where it's like the poor people pay the most in tax.
Yeah.
But I think it was something along those lines, but I can't remember the exact figures off the top of the dome.
Yeah, the number that pops into my head is the top 3%, that it was supposed to only affect like 97% of people were under whatever that boundary was. If it was $4 million, I can't say, but that it was supposed to only affect the top 3% of earners when it was rolled out, which is typical of, taxation is like, oh yeah, this is just going to affect the rich. And then through the wonders of inflation, it affects everyone.
Cast an increasingly broader net. Yeah, I've had a lot of those conversations too, and we're just, so many people are stuck inside the current paradigm, and they can't envision a world outside of it. Even when there's historical precedents that they could easily look back on and see, right? It's not like we're proposing here something, at least not in all cases, proposing something that has no precedent, that's never been done. I mean, you can look back to periods and be like, society doesn't fall apart when you're not taking half of people's paycheck. Like, in fact, it actually, you can make a strong case that it worked much better.
But John, what about the roads?
Who will build the roads?
Yeah, I know. But
inversely, though, you also have historical data that shows that every paper currency has ruined everything it touched.
Yeah, but people don't give a fuck. I mean, people don't allow historical precedent or logic and reason to conflict with the world that is in front of them.
It's kind of like Morpheus, where he's like, people are so inured by the system that they'll fight.
Yeah, well, it's exactly like that. I mean, that's why the Matrix is so great for plucking metaphors and applying them, to so many things that are happening today.
It's such a great documentary.
Yeah, it's so funny. I try to watch that movie all the time, but I've watched it like 20 times. And when I asked my girlfriend, I was like, what do you want to watch tonight? And she's like, I don't know, let's put on a documentary or this or that. I'm like, how about the Matrix again? Yeah, but the point, like in those conversations, because it sounds like we're discussing a utopia when we kind of invoke Bitcoin and all the wonderful things it's going to ameliorate and fix. But the broader point is like, it doesn't even matter, right? If this thesis plays out, I mean, Bitcoin is tax these nuts technology, basically. That's what it's meant to be. And so more capital and wealth that goes into the inviolable domain, the less there is in the violable domain. And that means the less there is to support those massive bureaucracies and those taxing agents and all that kind of stuff. So if Bitcoin survives, it just means like, it's just a matter of time before more capital flows towards less viable. And that just means over the course of time, there's going to be less taxes paid. There's going to be less institutions living off tax revenue. And that just means the state is going to shrink to a much smaller size. Now, I don't know if it takes 10 or 100 years, but I don't see how it can be any other way.
I think the principle of we overestimate how much we can do in a year and underestimate how much we can do in 10 sort of applies to this, where it's like, it's obviously speeding up very quickly. I mean, if we look around globally and see, gas prices going through the roof, energy shortages in Sri Lanka and the rest of it, in Europe now, and then you see like the food sort of stuff getting affected by that too, some power plants and like manufacturing companies having to shut down because of that. That to me indicates that like it's speeding up this process of like, I don't know what else to call it other than like the Great Reset. Is sort of like hurriedly coming towards our direction. And the more it comes towards that direction, the more uncertainty there is for people who are trying to have some sort of savings or wealth outside of that system. And the more pressure there is there, the faster this wheel sort of turns for reasons you just mentioned as well.
Yes, but are you saying that those are all reasons why this may happen sooner than we would expect?
Correct. Yeah, especially once like the more valuable figures start doing that. Um, like that counts for millions of lower socioeconomic valuable people, if you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
doing it. And it's just like, it's that guy who's partying at the concert by himself. And then all of a sudden more people join him. But like, if you think about that for billionaires, like things start stampeding pretty damn quick. I mean, if one man, George Soros, can break the Bank of England, what can America's billionaires do?
Mm.
And what other choice do they have?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the punchline, right? Eventually, again, just by virtue of the fact you have another domain where capital is not only less viable, like way less viable, but also more like equally useful, if not more, right? So you have the twin benefit. You're not just sequestering capital to get it to keep it out of the reach of the people that would seek to take it, but you're putting it into another productive and increasingly productive domain. And so with those two extremely strong incentives, I totally agree. It's just a matter of time, and that the option is there. It's just going to keep recurring to people when they encounter this problem. Doesn't matter where you are in the socioeconomic ladder, like you'll encounter this problem and you'll say, what are my options? I mean, some people won't, right? And they'll just be total victims to circumstance, and that's shitty, but it's also in
Their own
part on
fault.
them. Yeah. But a lot of people will see like, all right, this is the problem. What are the options? And the Bitcoin, the bright orange, the bright orange sign is just getting bigger and brighter all the time. And I think, people will funnel into it increasingly, and we'll get back to a far more righteous state where, whatever form of governance. So like when this process plays out and the state is less able to steal from people to fund, their activities, well, again, it'll shrink. What size? Who knows, right? Like, I know a lot of people have different philosophies on what it should be, but presumably there'll still be a role for managing the monopoly on violence, let's say, or maybe, so people will still want to coordinate in certain manner that can't be potentially organized or coordinated like by free market participants. Maybe, I don't know, but like I think the punchline is like, and the reason why I use the term righteous is because we'll get back to a place where those people are actually engaging in a system that they have approved of, right? Not just cast a vote once every 4 years or once every 2 years and then have no say in anything that happens in between, so.
Yeah. And the difference between like that being scaled up to a national version versus like a local jurisdiction where they vote for whatever policies that they all, and even then it's still democracy, and you're going to have these people that are well positioned for that transition into, the whole age where it's like I can earn whatever income if I'm capable in whatever jurisdiction. And so therefore these jurisdictions have to compete. And those people who are the most productive have the most sort of weight because they have the most economic resources at hand. Like
Mhm.
if the local sort of democratic rule is like, oh, we actually think you should pay more because you have more, all of a sudden the ease now to actually be like, actually, I think Costa Rica is calling my name. I'll see you guys later.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
like, it's going to be real fascinating to see how that pans out. And it's also kind of cool to see that there's a lot of infighting at the moment with the whole like Davos central banking sort of UN group, where you
Mm.
see that, like, I don't know, have you followed Tom Luongo's thesis?
No, who's that? See
Tom
the
Luongo, he's
Blink
like
182 guy? No,
no, no. He's like a
that's Tom
geopolitical,
DeLonge, I think. Yeah.
yeah, macro sort of guy. But what he and another dirtbag called Phil have been noticing is that like the Fed re-indexed its debt domestically from LIBOR to SOFR. So that just means that if they raise rates, that foreign powers can't raise rates in conjunction for the US domestic debt. And so like it enables them to essentially like destroy the offshore dollar market. And it was that market which was funding a whole lot of this fuckery.
I see. Right. So basically the Fed versus the WEF, or the, the
Correct.
European interests sort of thing.
And so the Fed has to sort of destroy the ECB because and the offshore dollar markets, because that's what's sort of funding this CBDC style takeover that they're attempting. And the Fed being backed by the New York boys' commercial banking interest, even though like JP Morgan helped fund a whole lot of transhumanism sort of stuff, they were like, if a CBDC is introduced, like our whole monopoly's made redundant. Yeah, no, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to pan out. So now you're watching like those two giants infight, and eventually you'll just watch rats jump ship. It's going to be awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fine, or it's an interesting theory, I guess. There's a, it's reasonably logical and rational. By the way, if you guys can hear that beeping, and anyone listening, I apologize. The power is currently out here, and that's what's keeping the Wi-Fi going. So, my bad. But yeah, no, it's an interesting theory. But also, I don't know, man. Like, I have a natural interest in how everything works. So like that's why I'm always going to have some base level interest in like those sorts of conversations and theorizing. But also I'm like the Bitcoin Zen, when you're so, when you've stepped through that portal and you're so fully into that other domain, like how relevant is all that stuff? Like, and I'm not saying we've all like being completely in Bitcoin land, we still have meat space lives, and the machinations that are happening politically around us have effects on us, of course, and all that stuff. But as it pertains to like financial machinations and our own, efforts to optimize our own situation, how relevant do you think that kind of stuff is? Like I watched right before this, I watched Jay Powell's speech because like I'm just kind of fascinated by the language he uses and what they're going to do. And, I like to be informed, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't change anything for me.
No. It changes some of your economic calculations if you're living in America. For instance, he said that housing prices are way too high and that's going to have to come down. He's sort of alluded to the fact that there'll be no Fed reversal, no Fed put. And so if you're looking to buy a house, you're looking to buy a car or anything of like significant value to you, then these things are relatively important because the Fed is trying to retain the dollar hegemony, the international hegemony. And in order to do that, it has to sort of sacrifice the domestic market, so equities and housing. So if you're economic resources and your wealth is tied up in those assets, then it's pretty relevant.
Well, yeah. When I said myself, I didn't mean like the average person. I meant me. Like, of course, if you're a normie and you have a stock portfolio and you have a mortgage and all that kind of stuff, I get it. What I'm saying is like being so all in Bitcoin and having constructed a life that is maximally, let's say, adaptable. This stuff is mostly irrelevant, right? Which is why like I get caught up in it a lot too, but I try to bring my focus back to things that are actually relevant, right? That are actually either meaningful or impactful or productive, because it's so easy to get, as we're barreling into like more and more clown world, and as things, degrade even more, there's going to be more and more like the drama of it all just pulls you in, right? Whether it's on Twitter or Tucker Carlson or, I just watched this insane Rashida Tlaib video that's going around on Twitter now about her questioning like the banking interests about funding oil and gas, investments and businesses. It's all so insane. And you can spend a whole day just consuming that garbage, but where does it leave you? It doesn't leave you any better off, right? So, and I think a lot of Bitcoiners are kind of starting, or maybe not even starting, have realized that for a long time. Like you got to be pretty careful about curating your focus and try to direct it towards things that are actually going to move the needle, not just, the the madhouse that is the current world, because this is just a downward spiral, right? Like the worse it gets, the more people are going to demand from the incompetent, corrupt politicians that delivered them the circumstance that they're unhappy with in the first place, and that just happens until something breaks. And
That's
you
the
got to
old
be careful how much attention you give to it.
the hard times make strong men make good times make weak men make hard times, like that philosophy. And then you overlay that over like the fourth turning, the short-term debt cycles and long-term debt cycles. It's like, okay, this just keeps on happening.
Yeah.
It kind of makes me wonder though, like if there goes to a Bitcoin standard, and as you say, there's going to be some form of governance, like surely there'll be some form of rent sinking that's like inevitably implemented, right? People will find a way.
You mean an example?
Well,
I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm just curious what you're thinking of.
I mean, if we can have America, the constitutional republic, primed off the Boston Tea Party, not paying taxes, what have you, turn into a national democracy where both presidents are saying that others are, a terrorist or an extremist and a threat to the country. Like, if that can happen to the most powerful empire today, then like, are we really thinking that these small, more fractioned sort of communities are going to be able to like not have that rent seeking inevitably introduced? Like, there's always going to be a return on violence, even if you can be like, oh, I lost it. And it's like, okay, oof. Anyone else lose theirs? Like there will be some form of rent seeking inevitably introduced.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
So can I jump in? Because
Sure.
This ties back to something, John, you were talking about the two realms, right? There's like the Bitcoin realm, and then there's the everything else realm. And the way that I've been explaining it lately is that in Bitcoin, ownership is knowledge. You either know the keys or you don't, and that's it. And that knowledge can either be encoded in the world, written down on a piece of paper, or, in a hardware wallet or something, or it can be in your head. And as long as some of that knowledge is in your head, it's untakeable. Like somebody can, if you have say a gold coin, something physical, they can kill you and take the gold coin, right? Your money or your life. In a Bitcoin world where some of the knowledge is in your head of what you own, if they kill you, all they've done is made it less likely that they will ever get your Bitcoin, right? Mm-hmm. So they can still kill you, right? But they can't take your Bitcoin. And it is the first thing that humanity has ever had with that property. The current geopolitical structure of nation states is the pinnacle of a world in which it is possible where superior violence can take property. If you kill the farmer, you get the farm. And so as a result, you create a defensive coalition to guard the farm, right? You work together, and then the largest defensive coalition is what wins, which currently is the United States in terms of violence under command. Bitcoin allows you to own something where the ownership is knowledge, and all the force in the known universe, all the force in the command of the solar system is not enough to take it from you. And it's the only thing with that property. That's
kind of dependent though, Jimbo. Don't you think like it's dependent on the individual in the sense that someone comes to your house and is like, hey, here's your kids and your wife lined up. You're going to give me those words. Realistically, who's not going to give that?
It will be the case that Bitcoin is headed towards the people who are willing to die, right? Because, and so in that scenario, like somebody comes to your house, blah, blah, blah. So this is where you have like a two-pronged approach. People are, in this country anyway, very into firearms, right? Second Amendment, and the purpose of a firearm is to protect yourself and to protect, your kind of immediate property, right? What it allows you to do is it allows you to take an altercation and escalate it to the point of death, yours or the assailants, right? Somebody's going to die in this scenario, right? That's what guns allow you to do. It allows you not to be kidnapped like your scenario. So that's the other half. So Bitcoin allows you to die with your coins. The great pharaohs of Egypt did not have this ability. They got their tombs robbed. But you can take your Bitcoin with you to the grave. the firearms, the other piece of it, the protection of your physical person, allows you to escalate the conflict to the point of death. And so as a result of those properties, Bitcoin will accrue to those who are willing to shed this mortal coil and take it with them.
The shadowy supercoder extremists.
Yeah, but that's the thing, is like there's nothing the state can do. If you are willing to defend your person and you are willing to take it with you, it cannot be seized, right?
Yeah.
And so this gets back to the value question. So right now, the market doesn't value that very highly. I mean, every day that we're under $1 million per coin, that we're under SATS head parity, is a mystery to me. I don't understand, because to me, the ability to have something where ownership is knowledge is so that people will say like, oh yeah, it's everything divided by 21 million. It's like, no, that's a false equivalence. That assumes that the Bitcoin is only worth what everything else is worth. But in my opinion, it could be worth considerably more. The value of Bitcoin is how much do you want something that nobody can take, like ever, right? That's the value of Bitcoin. And it's astronomical. But because humanity has never had an item with those properties, it's really hard to grok. Everyone lives in this world where you put your money in the bank, right? And it's the bank's money. If you buy stock, it's not yours. It's off in some database somewhere. And even if you had a certificate, it's based on the honoring of some corporate entity. And then your ownership claim that is, to that corporate entity is adjudicated by a legal system that you have no say over, right? There's all these intermediaries everywhere. It's like intermediaries all throughout. But now we have something where it's like, no, you know these words, and that's it. That's the ownership. And if you die, you take them with you. And so it's going to take people some time, but the value of that is incalculable. And so again, back to John's point about the two realms, I don't know how long it's going to take everyone to figure out that you don't have to trust people anymore. You don't have to give up all your sovereignty just to have some wealth in this world. You can have something that is unseizable. And the value of that, again, is just astronomical. But
yeah. It's nuts. Yeah, I totally agree with all that. I think maybe the distinction, Kiwi, that you were making was like, and maybe there has to be a distinction between rent seeking and coercion, and wherever the line there is, because like fiat money and all the institutions that bubble up around it certainly incentivize rent seeking in various forms, right? But if you eliminate that entirely, then the only means by, and to the point Jimbo was making, which again is insanely profound and so few people appreciate it, that for the first time ever, the most concentrated form of your wealth, i.e. money, and you, however we want to define that, have become one. There's no separation between them. There was always an incentive to separate you from your property. And you didn't necessarily, and actually that provided an incentive to kill the person, right? So the incentives, the return on violence was much higher because you could just kill the person and then take their property. Now that incentive, that return on violence is dramatically lower, because sure, you can still coerce and threaten and maybe extract that information from someone, but there's no guarantee that if you kill them, you'll get it. In fact, there's odds are if you kill them, you won't get it. And so that is a huge difference between killing someone and almost guaranteeing that you are able to get their property as a result of doing that. And then of course, there's a lot of in between, right? Like if whoever controls the monopoly on violence started taking those measures en masse, how quickly would people coordinate to resist that in some way, not only just in their individual ways of trying to get out of harm's way, but like if the abuse of the monopoly on violence became so obvious that people were going around threatening and coercing people to get information out of their brains, you would think that at least in places where there was a capacity, i.e. particularly in the US, there'd be a coordinated effort to push back against that. So I think,
I don't know about that, Don. In the sense that,
the pushback.
Yeah, and expecting like something to come from the masses in that regard. Like if we think back to early 2020, I never thought that there would be lockdowns and you're fucking made to wear a face like that doesn't do anything, and that in order to travel you'd have to get a vaccine that doesn't work. Like I never thought any of that stuff would ever occur, especially in the US. And so my sort of faith in like any sort of organized pushback is like, pretty minimal at this point. But we
got to be, so I don't know what timeline we're talking about, right? Because presumably the stage at which that might occur, I think the state might have been starved more than it is currently, right? Its capacity to steal from people by virtue of more people having made that shift into the Bitcoin domain means that maybe there is some shrinkage or some incapacity already. So like, I'm not saying necessarily that would work today, because I agree with you. And like, of course, like the last 2 years are incredibly, I mean, condemning on the capacity of people to push back against things that are wrong or whatever. But I'm just saying, like, however long it takes for this to play out, I think more people will choose to go into that domain. That will starve, the state of its ability to fund itself. It'll become increasingly desperate. This, the Bitcoin world will be, and like a lot of those people in the early days will be more difficult to nail down, right? The sovereign individual thesis they'll be playing out that thesis effectively. But over the course of time, like when the balance really shifts, because we were talking about a kind of future where you were saying, like, even in a hyper Bitcoinized world, what will rent seeking look like? I think it'll look very different. And I think in that type of a world where so many people have established greater sovereignty for themselves and they're more capable of maintaining that sovereignty, and they're more thoughtful about it, whatever proportion of people that is, I think there would be more natural pushback at abject and obvious abuses of whatever is left over of the monopoly on violence and whoever's administering it.
True. And everything comes home to roost eventually. And if you think about it in regards to like defensive technologies, like, I don't know if you saw Joe Rogers' recent video that he did at the Underground Citadel on 3D printing guns.
I haven't seen it yet. I got to watch it though.
It's unreal to watch that progression. And then if you think about like the turrets and drones that can be remotely operated, like there is going to be some weird sort of skirmishes go on for sure. I just don't know how it's going to that'll play out. So that's why I'm sort of fascinated. I kind of like asked that question initially kind of like to provoke the conversation. I don't think that it'll be like absent of rent seeking. I think there'll be like some form of it. I don't know what it would look like. Like the return on violence is reduced heavily. The ability to defend yourself with superior technology is better every day.
And the ability to remove yourself from the jurisdiction that's, more oppressive is way more in favor of the individual now too, right? You don't have to close off bank accounts, send money, do whatever. You can just up sticks and leave, right? So that creates a lot more pressure on, or a lot more incentive to behave well on whoever's administering the monopoly on violence too.
It's like 3 books conjoined: The Sovereign Individual, The Price of Tomorrow, and The Bitcoin Standard. Sort of facilitates this like maximum power to the individual that Ayn Rand would have a wet dream over.
Yeah, exactly. Jimbo, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, we were talking earlier about the effective tax rate. If you add up all the taxes, the thing that, so a while ago when I heard about MMT, I looked into it, and the thing is, MMT is 2 parts. It is a description of the world and prescriptions based on that description. The description part I actually think is correct, and so the description part of MMT says the state doesn't actually need money. They don't tax you because they need money. They make the money. They buy fiat. They declare what money is. So then what, then that leads to the question, why do you have taxes? Because the state doesn't actually need money. What they need is you. They need you to do work. They need physical things. So we talk about this tax rate, like how much of people's livelihood is being drained off by this state enterprise. And so I think that if people had actually all of that value that is being drained off by the state, the things that we buy, the things that make a good life that you consume, or that you just use and enjoy, those things would cost less. You'd have more quality because you'd have more value to use. And so again, going back to this idea that Bitcoin is the thing that that is inviolable. It's not takeable by force. You have this natural balance that goes on. So on the one hand, you might have people who want to rent seek and bring violence. the people to whom that violence might be done might say, okay, well, there's a gang in this area that wants to squeeze me for money. I'll go somewhere else. And you can sell your property there immediately if you want. Take your Bitcoin and leave, go somewhere else. Like, or send your Bitcoin to somebody else. So it's not even on your person. It's like, sorry, I sent it to my buddy. Like, he's over in Australia. Like, I can't do anything. There's nothing you can do. You want to get on a plane and go attack him? Fine, that's fine. So you have this like hot potato concept where you can just send it to your family or your friends if you need to get out of Dodge. So what that means is that people who would try to rent seek and would try to like impose a forceful regime on an area will suddenly find that all the people leave, or they just don't have anything worth taking anymore. And the places that are more consensual, the places that are more amenable to consensual exchange, are the places where people will naturally accrue, and all the value and all the resources and intelligence will be in those places. So it's not that rent seeking will be impossible. It'll just be outcompeted. Like, there just won't be any return on it. So then people will say, well, I tried to squeeze these people and everybody disappeared. Well, I guess I shouldn't try that again. I wonder how I can get these people to do something, give me some money, in a more consensual way.
Yeah. And I think there are, as much as I mostly attribute incompetence to, the institution of governance and government, I think there are some that recognize that, which is why you might expect the most extreme measures taken to, inhibit that or stop that in some capacity to be taken like now and in the medium term, like when this transition is really happening before it fully gathers steam. But no, I totally agree with that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's just going to be people seeking their best interest, and they now have a tool that allows them to facilitate that more than any tool they've ever encountered before by orders of magnitude. And so when you have that interest for yourself, and now you have a tool to make it happen, all that's going to happen is it's more of that is going to happen on a more rapid timeline. And we've all read The Sovereign Individual, right? I mean, they even invoke, or they even bring up the utility of a global pandemic as a means to kind of stop the flow of people, right? And like you'd bring that up today to any normie and be like, well, that's absurd. And I'm not even like, let's not even be in the realm of conspiracy here. I'm not even saying like it would have consciously been invoked for that reason necessarily, but just the circumstance, right, that's shifting so quickly, where the legacy institutions of power and government are losing their grasp on things. And so they would naturally capitalize on anything that happens that would allow them to maintain a grasp or to tighten that grasp. And whether it's a pandemic or whether it's, climate change narrative or whatever it is, they'll even the morons among them, like, the Rashida video that I referenced earlier, will jump on it because it's a means for them to either one, maintain control, or two, feign virtue by acting like they're using their position of power to do something good in the world, which usually has the opposite effect. So I think it's okay. No, go ahead.
Well, I like everything you're saying, and I think you're right that if the state were an entity, it would very much want to destroy Bitcoin. The one little pushback I would say is that, in addition, there are people, like the state is made of people, and people have their own little skirmishes and they have their own goals and aspirations. And one of the easiest hedges one could do as a member of the state is to say, you know what, I'm just going to get a little Bitcoin,
right,
just in case, just as an insurance policy case doesn't work out. And then we get the magic of NGU, and now suddenly a larger fraction of their portfolio is in Bitcoin, and now suddenly their interests are aligned with Bitcoin. Like, I don't know if I really want to see this thing fail anymore, because now I'm worth way more. So that would be my one little bit of pushback, is like, I know that if the state were an entity, or if all states collectively were an entity, obviously they would band together to destroy Bitcoin, but they're not. They're made of people, and that's why I tend to be bullish on Bitcoin winning peacefully, because individuals will defect kind of one at a time.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. What'd you say?
I said, but it's a weapon, Jimbo. Remember, mining is a weapon.
Oh yeah, I remember that meme.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. this is an individual revolution, and it impacts people's lives individually, and everyone responds and can only respond to incentives as individuals. But I just mean that the circumstance that's, the current money and the however we wound up in this situation has a paradigm to it, and that paradigm is going to latch on to things that give it sustenance, that allow it to survive, and that acts through people, oftentimes even unbeknownst to them, which is why they'll just, the whole agent metaphor in the Matrix. Here we are again, another great metaphor, and I think that's true. And when and it'll become more and more apparent that is narrative rather than reality as people step into the Bitcoin world and they start to see things differently, and they start to assess things differently, and they start to realize, oh, there is an alternative, right? Because so much of people's kind of rigidity in their mindset and as a result, how they act in the world and the things that they attempt to do is, almost by thinking that the world, like reality is reality. Like it's just objectively, this is how it is. And it almost ought to be that way because it is that way. And that's the strength of a paradigm, right? It makes you feel and think that it is reality, and like you're just observing it objectively, almost, in a sense. And I think a lot of people would argue that. And then you step into a domain, or you're introduced to a perspective that's so different. It's such a paradigm shift. And if, even before you can appreciate all the different nuances of what those differences are, you're at least is impressed upon you, oh, there's a different way of looking at things. There's a different way of doing things that's now been introduced to my perception, to my consciousness. And that alone, just the introduction of a alternative, can have pretty profound effects for how you judge how you're seeing things and the validity of your perception and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's going to increasingly happen. And as you said, Jimbo, it's going to be more and more apparent that choosing the latter, choosing the Bitcoin one, whether it's a jurisdiction or just, the happiness and enthusiasm that, the individuals that you observe in your life that have done that are experiencing, that's going to be an incentive. That's going to be compelling. That's going to be the sales pitch for people to do the same, because you're going to have these two things. Like, one is degrading, and one is you're paying more tax and getting less for it, and there's more violence in your community, and your relationships are less genuine, and the madness is more absurd all the time. And then there's this other place where it's the exact opposite, right? Things are more rational, things are more logical, you have more freedom, you have more wealth, you have more options, you have more sincere relationships, you're healthier, you're feeling better about yourself. And that's a pretty,
it's based on consent.
Yeah, exactly. That's a pretty easy judge to make once you start seeing it. And I think that's how things are going to play out.
That's a good point. And the more that plays out, John, the more that the state will lash out, and the more that the state tries to lash out, the more of that
more apparent the difference becomes, right?
Yeah, exactly right. It'll be weird because the US, if it bans it, it's horrible for medium long term strategy, because then other countries will pick it up. If it doesn't ban it, though, it loses its dollar hegemony and its rent-seeking capability for those who are, largely dictating policy. So it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And if you go down the latter path and actually start trying to get rid of it, all of your productive capital and people who possess that are going to start fleeing, as you suggested. So it's going to be crazy to watch this pan out, because because it's truth, it's based on consent. You can't be stolen from through inflation, etc. So when they try attack it, the virtue signalers that try to attack it, it's oh, you don't care about consent, you don't care about Me Too, you don't, it's just they have no leg to stand on. It's oh, but it consumes energy. It's okay, and the military industrial complex doesn't. Fiat stealing your wealth and putting you on this rat race doesn't consume energy. It's just there's no clear way of how you would attack it or try and mobilize the masses against it. Right. So it's going to be fascinating watching it play out over the next few years. What do you think some of the bigger milestone components would be on its way to sort of hyper Bitcoinization?
Who's the question for? Yeah.
Yeah, you go, Jimbo. You want to say
Either.
something?
Oh, yeah, it's okay. I actually don't have a ready-made answer for that one. What are you gonna say?
Well, I mean, milestones, I'm not sure. I think things are going to get, I mean, expect the unexpected, I guess. I don't think there's much capacity for us being able to predict things. I think people will continue to try to follow their incentives and seek freedom. I mean, I genuinely think freedom is the ultimate incentive, even for people that don't really recognize it in their life, or even for people that are pursuing it in the wrong way, because that's certainly, we don't always pursue things we want in the correct way. And so I think a lot of people probably recognize or would tacitly affirm the value of freedom, but perhaps they're not interpreting it or pursuing it the right way. But I think, like, agency, right? The ability to do what you think is right, I think, is one of the strongest incentives. And to your point about damned if you do, damned if you don't, I agree with that. And I think that's one of the really intriguing aspects about Bitcoin, is that it's basically forcing people to do the right thing given a sufficient timeline. Because as you say, they'll be confronted like, okay, we ban it, we screw ourselves. We don't ban it, we lose what we currently have, this, fraudulent, unfair monopoly on things. Okay, so what's our only option? Your only option is to submit yourself to what's right. That's your option. And Bitcoin, by virtue of its permanence, by virtue of its absoluteness, is impressing that upon the world. And I mean, it's providing it to people who want it and willing to take it, but it's impressing it upon people who don't want it and wouldn't willingly take it. I mean, and how crazy is that a piece of technology is forcing, in a sense, what I think we would all, agree is a moral good on the world. Like, it's forcing people to take and make that choice, regardless of whether their own character would have done it absent that, type of forcing or offer. It's really interesting.
Kind of on a state level too. Did you see Bukele's speech at the UN yesterday?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, he's sort of saying the same thing. It's like his house analogy was so fantastic, to put things into perspective, being like, oh, you've got the wealthy neighbor, and you're trying to make repairs to your house to make it better for everyone who lives under it. And your wealthy neighbor feels like he has to come over and tell you not to repair your house for God knows what reason.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty classic, but like, is that another person who's pursuing his perceived idea of freedom for him and his country, but perhaps doing it through the wrong mechanism, because like they reduced a whole lot of their violence in that country and made it feasible for more tourism, etc. But saying that you're going to starve inmates, so that their family members and members outside of that jail is like, it's pretty messed up situation. And like, who decides who's in jail and who's starving? Like, it's still the monopoly on violence, even if it is a Bitcoin country.
Yeah. I mean, some things are complicated. That one's, because it's so easy to just say, well, there's certain immutable principles and this is how you should orient your life and stuff like that. And then Bukele is a great example. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Is that method just or unjust? Well, you could say, well, it's completely unjust. How could you starve another person? How could you remove, due process for just because you think someone's a part of a violent gang? So yeah, that's a pretty good argument. Say, well, if you're one of the family members of one of the victims of gang violence and, your whole family's been murdered as a result, maybe it seems just to you. And so, and then he is also potentially being someone who's trying to mediate this massive shift that we've been exploring that's happening, which is going from peak fiat, peak nation state in size and power and influence, recognizing that a reckoning is coming and attempting to be part of, and potentially, I mean, I don't know what his true motives are, but potentially trying to be someone who's trying to be part of a reasonably stable transition from one to the other. And part of that might be his adoption of Bitcoin, and part of that might be his rhetoric and initial overtures around freedom. So, and like, would you want that responsibility to go from peak fiat and peak statehood to whatever the fuck Bitcoin is bringing us into?
Absolutely
I sure wouldn't. I'd rather
No, I don't think
manage
anyone
it
really
for
would.
myself. Right. And there's
And
certainly a certain condemnation to be, well, there's an argument to be had that people that want to assume that position, maybe they have a certain character flaw or failing to presume that they should have that power or capacity over other people. But then you could easily just say, yeah, well, what if they feel a sense of duty because they know that there's so much power in that position that if a better person doesn't attempt to occupy it, someone way worse will, and that will facilitate even worse outcomes. So there's an interesting conversation at a minimum on every kind of level of this stuff, or at least it seems to be.
I'm not trying to put him through any purity test. I was just trying to highlight that what he is doing in regards to starving them is a slippery slope, and also that it's a country that's transitioning to the life raft, but there's still some form or capability of rent seeking and monopolizing, so it's
there's a massive capability still, because none of the population effectively uses Bitcoin, right? They haven't. This only happened, that whole shrinking and rent seeking only happens when every individual within a jurisdiction or society has the capacity to say no, right? And now we're not there whatsoever. But if every single person in El Salvador had 12 words in their head, and there was a Bitcoin circular economy, and nobody could track anything anyways, and everyone was just doing cash transactions for all of their, for exchanges, and everything was voluntary, like, then it would be hard for, the monopoly on violence to rent seek in any broad capacity. I think, the interesting question is what happens in the interim, I think. And to your comment about you're not trying to put Bukele through a purity test, like, I kind of am. I mean, I'm interested in discussing his character and what the character of people who would presume to take this task of being at the head of the monopoly on violence in whatever jurisdiction in this transition that we're experiencing. Like, I think that's a valid conversation to have on what type of people should be engaged in that, and to what extent we should support them or not support them. This is a reasonably interesting conversation.
I'm just wary of purity tests after I've applied that to a few people, and humans being infallible, all of a sudden I'd be like, nope, that person failed my purity test, and then you like disregard them, but they produce some amazing content. And it's like, if you focus on the concepts rather than the person, then you tend to have a much more informed and better curated.
But I think that's a immature emotional response to things. I think everyone, the whole, kind of the Christian notion and most religious notions are, you want to attempt to hold people to the highest standard possible, but you also want to attempt to understand and empathize and forgive for times when they inevitably and forever misstep on that path. And I guess what you're looking for more than anything is that they're engaging that process with the utmost integrity and honesty, not that they're always going to engage it perfectly, because nobody will. So I'm all for purity tests, but not dismissing someone because they fail one of them,
Yeah, I like to keep it about 50-50 shit posts and walls of text. That way I'm guaranteed to be dismissed by anybody who would dismiss me.
Super cool.
Yeah, boy, I called that wrong. Ugh. Well,
were you in the 100K, 200K, 300K cheerleading crowd?
Oh, absolutely, 100%. So what happened was, when we started to blast off in 2021, I was looking at the charts and projecting a 10x increase from where we were at 20K in early 2021. And I said, okay, well, that's going to take us into the 100,000s. And for me to get back to this milestones question, to me, 300,000 per Bitcoin is like a key milestone. And the reason it's key is because at 300,000, you start to imagine a million. Like, could it go to a million? Like, is that possible? And once that mental anchor is there, it becomes an attractor. And so, and then once you get to a million, that's when all bets are off, because to me, at $1 million for Bitcoin, it no longer makes sense to price it in dollars. You just go with like sat cent parity. It's a penny stock now. And then all the degenerate gamblers and all the hard money advocates are aligned on like, yeah, it's a penny, and it goes from 1 million to 2 million, aka 1 cent to 2 cent per sat overnight. Like that was my mentality. So I started advocating this view, and calling it the super cycle theory, which was, okay, once we get past 100,000, we need to get and surpass 300, because then people will imagine a million and like rocket booster your way into like vertical ascent. And then somehow we crapped out at 68,000, and now we're still measuring in tens of thousands of dollars. So we're in this.
Excuse me, sir. Did
Yes.
we get to 69?
Huh? Yeah. Yeah,
Pretty
69. Yeah. So so that unfortunately is where we're at. Is we're in this awkward middle ground, 18,000 whatever it is today, 20 is too much for a random person to pay for crazy internet money. They think that that's ridiculous, and what about the environment and all this stuff. And then, but after $1 million, now it's a penny stock. And then now it's immediate explosion. So I miscalled it. I had no idea, and and it's fine. I'll keep pushing this meme forever, but I don't know when.
Now you failed the purity test. You're going to be canceled.
Yep, cancel me, please.
Well, I don't think anybody thought we would be at 18,000 in the fall of 2022. Now, I've never engaged in price predictions because, I know the nature of this thing. And even though, I mean, had you asked me like, 50, like what do you think is more likely that we'd be at 100K by now than 18K by now? Definitely would have said 100K, but Bitcoin is still such a drop in the ocean. And as you said earlier, Jimbo, like it's hard for me to empathize with a world that's valuing this thing so little for what it offers, valuing it at this level, at this point in time. Like, as you said, I mean, I don't think there's anything more valuable, right? And for all the benefits that it permits. And it's kind of a commentary on where we're at and how blind people are to the problems that exist, and how blind people are to the potential for resolution or, potential solution that Bitcoin represents to many of those problems. And then layering on top of that, the potential that Bitcoin represents for beneficial things that aren't even solutions to problems we have, but are just outright goods that we've never experienced before. But again, I'm like increasingly kind of overwhelmed with a sense of peace about it all. Like it's all just proceeding apace, and more education gets out there every day, and more people are talking about it every day. And more important than anything, more people like us are being changed and oriented by it, right? We're changing the course of our lives. We're changing our work. We're changing our behavior. We're changing our perspective on things. We're changing the value that we bring to the world. We're changing the value of ourselves and our character and all that kind of stuff. And so like, we're not watching on the sidelines. This thing is us. We are what is happening here. Each one of us who steps through that orange door into the orange domain. And, maybe there'll never be a point where like, oh, there, it happened. That was the moment of global adoption. That was the moment of hyper Bitcoinization. It will be a slow trickle of more and more people moving towards areas where there's more freedom, and moving towards areas where they can be more in control of their lives, and where they're safer, and where they can pursue what's most meaningful to them. And then, you wake up year to year and you're like, wow, that changed. I didn't kind of see it when it was happening, but that's different now. And that's different now. And, 40 years, the three of us will have this conversation. And if we're not all dead, then we'll probably look back and be like, like when did that thing that we now recognize as definitively different, when was the time that changed? And the answer will probably be, there's no definitive answer. Like everything is always in flux, and the change is always happening. And most often change doesn't happen on the timeline that we wish it would. We always, of course, we all have high time preference in that regard, but things are, all things considered, things are happening pretty damn fast, right? We're 13 years into this, and
for sure,
there's a lot going on.
One of the things I love the most about it is like, it's all like, for the Western world, it's those who are more ideologically driven that come to grok it earlier.
Right.
But for the rest of the world, it's people who are pushed into it because of like rampant inflation or tyranny or what have you. And so, like, what I love about it is the selective adoption largely puts it in the hands of people who understand the qualms a lot better, and they're the early adopters. And so usually you have that whole generational thing where the second generation may follow, but the third generation usually fucks it up and is spoiled or what have you. But for the next like few generations, it's going to be people who understand the principles of like how we got here and why this is important. And that's a huge change. So I'm looking forward to seeing how that sort of permeates throughout each, person's incentives and actions. And it's going to be pretty mad to see it happen.
Totally. I mean, it's another one of those kind of filters, the current and the filters that the incentives in the system create, right? So you're mentioning these rent seekers before and all these shitty politicians and bureaucrats and stuff like that. I mean, they are the current master incentive of the system, right? To get close to the monetary spigot and the power that permits is, are you morally flexible? Are you willing to bend on some of your, principles and values? Are you willing to do whatever it takes, for a paycheck or whatever? Can we appeal to your ego and your desire for power and all that kind of stuff? That's what the current master incentive of the system selects for. But what you're describing, Kiwi, is like a different incentive selecting for one, yes, necessity, but wrapped up in that is people that are curious and people that, desire freedom for themselves, people that willingly opt in and value a system where everyone is operating by the same rules. Nobody has an unfair advantage. And so the emerging master incentive is selecting for an entirely different set of behaviors and personality traits and principles and values and morals, et cetera. And again, we'd all probably agree that they're the best ones. They're very good ones rather than very bad ones. And so what kind of a world does that create when the master incentive is sending out signals to everybody and to the market that are based on principles and values like truth and freedom and fairness and goodness and honesty and integrity and all the other ones we could list?
And consent. Like,
yeah, you get a system predicated on that.
Exactly. It's such a primary distinction where it's like the current system, it completely disregards consent fundamentally. And so anyone who like argues for it is already like arguing against the necessity for consent to be prevalent. And so it's just like a losing battle from the outset. It's just like such a weird thing to grok.
To realize, and then you look around partially a slave.
Yeah. And then you look around at Clown World, it's like, oh, like that is just another, layer on top of the disregard for consent. Mm-hmm. And then they try to do it virtuously though, like as if they're representative of the people to disregard consent. Like there's a few questions that are just so like concise and just piercing for NPCs that it's just like, I love them. For like one of my favorite ones is like, how do you think they monopolize and debase the currency in the name of stability? How does that make sense to you? And then it's just like, there's nothing really you can say. Like, is theft bad? Yes. Does consent matter? Yes. It's like, okay, well, let's apply it to this current model. And it's just like falls apart on itself. And then you go to this model, which they're trying to ostracize. When that's the comparison, it's like it's a really interesting dynamic. And you're saying that the return on violence and stuff is going to be reduced and people are going to be able to flee, etc. It will lead that way, but do you think there's like a significant threat to being like personally connected with it in the short to medium term?
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yes and no. I think the problem is one of education. Like I said, I think you have to be willing to die and you have to be willing to defend yourself from death. If you're willing to do those two things, then you're fine. A lot of people are NIMs in the Bitcoin space, and that's fine. Like it's great to run a low profile. I do to a certain extent, not as hardcore as some people, but at the same time, like your defensive capabilities have to be something beyond just hiding. Like you have to be able to stand there and say, you can kill me, but you're not getting my Bitcoin. And that, I think that's a personal, I mean, I've gone through that process, and I think a lot of people need to go through it. The other thing is you don't have to die, because let me give you an example. So I don't know to what degree the audience of this will understand what I'm about to say, but when you send a transaction in Bitcoin, one of the fields on the transaction is the minimum block height, the height at which this transaction will be valid. Okay. So one thing you can do, what that allows you to do, is you can make a transaction that won't be valid for, 100,000 blocks, like a year in the future, whatever, however long it is. Pick a time frame, 6 months. So you make a transaction and it won't be valid for 6 months. You can sign that transaction and email it to somebody else and say, okay, this transaction is not good now, but 6 months from now, you could drop this on the blockchain and you'll get the funds, right? Then if you just move any of the UTXOs that are involved in that transaction beforehand, that transaction becomes invalid because it would try to double spend. It would try to move a UTXO twice. So what this allows you to do is lets you do a dead man switch, where you can email to your next of kin or whoever a transaction that would pay them in the event of your disappearance. And so, yeah, you can know without doing anything that it's going to be transferred. You could even sign a transaction that will send it now, but don't email it to them. Just keep an encrypted copy. Then if shit hits the fan and the mobs are coming to your door, you just go ahead and send it. Boom. Now it's sent. Like now I don't have it anymore. Like if you kill me, I don't have it. It's gone. Right.
Just make sure RBF is turned off.
Yes. Yeah. You don't want to have your transaction overrun by your own transaction. So my point is, like, the tools are there. The UX is horrible. Like the UX for doing these types of things that I'm talking about don't make it easy. But one could imagine a better UX that's like, here's the Bitcoin insurance policy UX. We're going to help you build an insurance policy that works for you. Do you want a transaction that has these properties? Do you want a transaction that has these properties? When are you going to come back and sign your next one? Like, let's develop a process for you, almost like TurboTax, but for your Bitcoin insurance, right? And you just answer a bunch of checkboxes. Then it's like, okay, you need to sign this, email this to whoever, save a encrypted copy of this. Like, gives you an instruction booklet, and all you got to do is carry out the instructions. And now you are impervious to death. Like, obviously you can still die, but your Bitcoin holdings are impervious. Like, they can be transferred. Those tools exist today. They've existed for a long time. It doesn't require any new soft forks or anything. It just requires better UX and understanding the tools that are available. So anyway, I'm super bullish on all that stuff. And when and if we ever hit this super cycle I had predicted, I'll take a good year off. And I'm a software engineer, so my job. So I would be developing this stuff, but
Well, that would be awesome, because more solutions like that are needed, right? Because it's kind of a patchwork now, and nothing is really super ideal. But dead man switches in the past have relied on certain email servers, perhaps, and this and that. But if you could do a dead man switch on with a Bitcoin signed transaction, then you're relying on the most reliable thing, which is the Bitcoin blockchain itself, right? And
yes.
So that would be awesome. And that would be a really tidy way to handle that issue.
Yeah, I mean, you can do it right now today. If you have Sparrow or Electrum Wallet, either of those will let you modify the lock time. So right. I mean, yeah, it's just not easy. And then you have to take a signed transaction file and email it to somebody, and then explain to them, hey, error, by the way.
Right. So work has to be done on the UX, but in principle, it's brilliant. Like that, having that capability is incredible. And yeah, it solves one of the big problems of inheritance, and that capacity also influences the returns on and incentives to violence, right? Knowing that people could have structured things in that way. So and Kiwi, to your point, or to your question, I don't know how much risk public Bitcoiners are taking these days. I mean, a lot of people own Bitcoin, right? So it would be quite a crackdown or quite a effort to crack down on anyone who owns or has ever been public about Bitcoin. So I lean towards that not happening, but at the same time, realizing what scale of threat this is to, the existing power structures, it's hard for me to think that some form of crackdown doesn't come. And so, and to your point about like clown world, like that system of incentives that this current system has generated creates all the conditions for that absurd asinine behavior we see in clown world, right? Like the whole, how people have abdicated so much of their responsibility in so many areas of their life to other people, and how as a result of that they're getting these signals that like your agency and your logic and your decision making doesn't really matter. You don't really need to worry about refining that because you're not in control anyways. So just sit there and watch the TV and eat the shit and don't think about things. We'll take care of it all. And how much does that eat away at your soul? What does that take from you that is like so fundamentally important? And I would say a lot. And as a result, your psyche just spits out these, it creates a neuroses, right, of your psyche, and it creates all these neurotic behaviors that we see in the world today. So I don't have much faith in persuasion in terms of bringing about hyper Bitcoinization, because like we can't, the discourse out in normie land is like, could you tell me what a man or a woman is? No, I'm afraid not. Okay, if we can't get that, then we ain't going nowhere with, the whole money and state and thing, So, and even with people that are more reasonable, because I'm being a bit tongue in cheek there, persuasion has never been a super effective thing for me when I try to, articulate the benefits of Bitcoin to people. What's way more persuasive, and what's always more persuasive, is how it affects and transforms your own life, and having other people witness that and be like, what the fuck is that guy doing? Why is he, so happy, energized, successful, have good relationships, whatever? Like that's what people pay attention to. People will resist persuasion and logic until they're blue in the face, but silently they'll be looking at you and being like, what's that dude doing? Because everyone wants those things in their own life. They're just not always willing to explicitly admit to that and engage in the conversations that might help them derive more clarity about it.
Yeah, that's been really prevalent, seeing all these people that used to be like slobs in so many regards, and now they're like gone from being like pale, fat, and not much in regards to like economic resources to being like jacked, tan, carnivorous, and have a decent amount of savings that no one can fuck with. It's like that transforms a person in so many different ways. And watching your podcast, John, with like just your average pleb and hearing about every person's like hero journey has been like one of the best forms of content, is just watching all these people who transform their lives for the better.
It's my favorite, man. I can't, it's like, it's all I really like to do, because it's so great to hear from Bitcoiners out in the wild and hear the story, and even some that have just came in like 2021, for example, and seeing how much, their perspective has been reoriented since that time, and how that's bled into changes in their life and what they value and what they're pursuing. Like, and everyone's, so far, touch wood, everyone's been so awesome, like, cause there's no filtering process here, right? Someone says, yo, like, yeah, I'd like to jump on the pod one day. And I'll be like, sure, you're the first one I saw, so we'll go for it. And there's no prep or anything like that. And we just fire it up, and people end up being, awesome. And that's what Bitcoin does to people, and
I thought I thought I passed a rigorous vetting process. That's what I was told.
Yeah. So
that's just the dirtbag test.
Yeah, but Jimbo, to one of the things you were saying is like, not everyone's going to basically like fully internalize this and basically get to the point where they're ready to die for it and defend and that kind of stuff. I mean, people, I think, need to appreciate that the responsibility you're willing to take as an individual is what's going to determine what the world looks like for you in the future. Like, you're not going to get to a place where you can stop worrying about all of these things, whether it be you taking responsibility for your own finances, or you taking responsibility for the safety of yourself and your family, or you taking responsibility for your health. It's like, it's not a temporary thing to get to a transition. Yes, there's going to be a lot more services that help you facilitate those things in the future. But the punchline is that, like, this is a revolution and a mechanism and a tool that's bringing back both freedom and responsibility to each individual. And that's a process of like permanent transformation, I guess, is the right way to look at it. It's like that's what your life becomes then. It's not like, oh, let's take this responsibility in the interim period and then we'll be able to like take our foot off the gas later. No, it's about constructing a life with those fundamental pillars as the most important things, and then allowing a life to flourish around having established those pillars. And that this is partially why I think like in the future, there'll be a lot more space and a lot more interest in things like ritual and tradition and things like this amongst, hyper Bitcoinized jurisdictions or communities or the world generally, because there'll be a recognition of the fundamental importance of certain responsibilities and certain aspects of life. And there'll be a desire and an incentive to keep reminding people or inculcating in young people in their education the importance of these things. And it'll be different from place to place and it'll evolve over time, but it's such a departure from the current culture, like I was saying, because all of this stuff is just abdicated, pretty much all forms of responsibility. And what that does to the individual is just, it almost dissolves them into into an NPC, right? Into someone who's just willing to swallow any gobbledygook that gets thrown their way. And it's so easily manipulatable to whatever issue for whomever's ends. And, the process that I think many of us are engaging in is withdrawing from that and reconstituting things on a much stronger individual basis. And we're exploring all the different ways and all the different domains in which we must do that, and which we have the opportunity to do that. And we're viscerally feeling the benefits of it. And I think that's why we continue to pursue it on that path, because every time we do that, we like it, right? Like we like the feeling, like it's a good feeling to take that responsibility and then be granted that freedom or liberation on the other side. And we're trying to figure out how many domains we can do that in.
Amen.
Yeah, it has been wicked to see that occurring on a bigger and bigger scale, and seeing how that affects different cultures in different parts of the world as well. The ability to say no, like, don't you think it's so crazy watching these people in like Lebanon and stuff having to go to the bank and with a gun to try and get their own money back? Like,
yeah, I mean,
it's crazy.
Dude, it's just all of these little snapshots of clown world, you could take from Twitter basically every day. And you just like, first of all, totally expected and unsurprising to many of us, I'm sure, but just another example of the cracks and the faults in the way things are currently structured, and obviously it's not sustainable, but it's wild to see.
Yeah. I liked earlier John, your point about people orienting towards true things. As I mentioned, I'm a software engineer, so I have a kind of a soft spot for things being correct and like true. You don't just fudge it in programming. It has to be correct, or the computer will do exactly what you say, whether you said it right or not. Yeah. So, but what's interesting is, we have this engine now, Bitcoin, which is a truth machine. Every 10 minutes on stochastically, there's a block, and that encodes the truth that everybody agrees on. And we have this world where the mechanisms of truth making are changing. We had the age of mass media, which is giving way to the age of social media, which is mediated by these algorithms that are directed in particular ways. So there's this like thirst for something that's true, and now we have something. It's like, well, here you go. Here's a global database that the state of which everyone agrees on after a couple of blocks. I mean, the next block might be a question mark, and occasionally you get collisions, but after an hour or two, everybody agrees. And so, what is the value of the thing that everyone can agree on in a world of lies and deception? Every day that goes by is just a significant mystery to me that we're not already like post hyper Bitcoinization, but it's just going to take time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just speaks to the state of the world, and I agree. I mean, what does it mean to have to be able to converge on such a truth in a world that has you can make a case has descended into a type of relativism that's been extremely detrimental to, many aspects of an individual's life who's within it. But one of the things that I'm extremely excited about is the beauty that will come from this transition. And you can look back to, and people like Safe and others have popularized the idea of looking back into other sound money eras and looking at the architecture and the art and seeing how it's been different. I definitely think there's validity to that argument or characterization, but also in other ways. I mean, I think to your point about truth, truth is a thing, through the ages that people have revered in different ways and for different reasons. And I think that we have such a profound, engageable, verifiable form of it now. Like, I think, and this will sound weird to some, probably not to you two, but I think it will inspire in many ways. It will invoke and bring forth like inspiration and creativity and beauty in people. People will want to glorify it in certain senses, or at a minimum, be put in a position as a result of it that they can express their creativity, they can dedicate themselves to great works. But then, of course, it begs the question, like, well, if something has freed you up to pursue what is most meaningful to you, building a building that takes 100 years or some, a piece of art or some great work, well, will you not at some point come to glorifying or revering the thing that permits you to do that? And I think it's logical that at least some will. And so I think we're on the precipice not only of just a great deal more freedom in all of our lives than we've ever experienced, but a great deal more beauty. And you could make the case that, well, many people have made the case, I suppose, that, beauty is one of the things that makes life most worth living, and surrounding yourself with beauty in all of its forms is maybe the name of the game more than anything. And maybe you might, in some sense, argue that freedom and beauty are somewhat synonymous. I certainly think freedom is beautiful, but let's say the manifestations of it, the physical manifestations of it, there might be distinctions there. But all just to say, I mean, I think that is going to be part and parcel with what's happening here. And I can't wait, because it's inspiring. Like, if you've ever, and this is kind of a trite example, but if you've ever been to like Vienna, for example, or Karnak in Egypt, Karnak Temple, or like these places that just, they're so inspiring because what went into them, like the mathematics that went into them, the creativity that went into them, the work and dedication that went into them, the resources, like all that stuff. And this is a representation of all of that. And it's stunning. It's awe-inspiring. It's beautiful. And I think what Bitcoin represents is going to precipitate or inspire more of that than has this world, or at least, the civilizations that we're aware of, has ever occurred before. And I don't know if we'll be around to see that part of it. I hope we're around to see at least part of it. But yeah, I'm super jazzed about the beauty, the onrush of beauty that I think is upon us. Thoughts?
Like you were saying, reflecting this in 40 years' time around a barbecue with a glass of whiskey, like in 40 years' time, John, I would imagine we would have seen a fair bit.
Yeah, well, like we say, I mean, we'll either not be here or hopefully, be enjoying an extremely beautiful, peaceful, free environment. And
yeah, we're aware of what the arc is. It's just about getting to it at the right time, being in the right place at the right time, and avoiding the incoming tidal wave that will inevitably come.
Yeah, something. I mean, again, like Jimbo's point, who knows? I mean, again, it's too difficult to predict. But we think, it's a huge David versus Goliath sort of thing. But maybe it'll surprise. Maybe like the Soviet Union, it'll kind of die out with a whimper rather than a bang. I mean, who knows?
Well,
yeah, I hope for that.
Yeah, as individuals, we have a particular viewpoint, and I don't mean that we have separate viewpoints, which we do. I mean, like, there's like the individual frame. And so people will talk about money like flowing in, like they'll say, okay, money flows into Bitcoin. It's like, that's an individual frame, because from your perspective as an individual, if you spend your money to buy Bitcoin, your money has flowed into Bitcoin. But from the perspective of Bitcoin and the monetary system, from the like general perspective, neither more Bitcoin now exists nor more money exists. Your allocation has changed, but somebody else took the money and gave you the Bitcoin, and their allocation has changed. But overall, the amount of Bitcoin is fixed. There's just only so much. I mean, unless you lose it, right? Unless you burn it. And the amount of, fiat or whatever you exchange for it is also fixed. So the price, while it's easy to think about like, oh yeah, there's more buyers than sellers, it's like, no, there's always the same number in any transaction. Somebody bought and somebody sold. The price is the relative valuation. It's the thing, it's people want it more. It's aspirational. Like, how much do I want this thing? And really it's the marginal buyers and sellers. Like, how much do they want this thing versus that other thing? So that's why I keep coming back to this idea. People talk about like, well, money can flow. Like, what about, the bond market is $400 trillion. And it's like, what if all that money flows into Bitcoin? That money can't flow into anything, because the money exists. Like, the bonds exist. The amount people paid for the bonds exists. The Bitcoin exists. It can change hands. And what it can really do is it can change value. Like, how much do people want this thing versus this other thing? So to the point about like how long it could take, I don't know how long it's going to take. It keeps boggling my mind that we're not there already. But that's because like I came to this conclusion. I mean, I was fully like a full believer in Bitcoin in early 2017 when it finally broke the old like Mount Gox prices. And I was like, holy crap, this thing's unkillable. Like, I'm all in. Like that was my epiphany moment, was before the run up in 2017. Like when it hit $2,000 in 2017 in March, I was like, this thing's unkillable. Like, this is great. And then I fell in the rabbit hole. And then I started doing all this research and understanding like how it worked. But anyway, I think part of the reason why it's gradually then suddenly, and part of the reason why I think it could be very, very fast, is because right now, most people know zero Bitcoiners. Most people don't know anybody. Like, nobody's talked to them about it at all. And people who know any Bitcoiners mostly know one. Like, it's just that one weirdo who always talks about it, and that's it. Or maybe it's that crypto guy who's trying to sell me like 8 pictures, right? And that's it. That's their only exposure. If you only know one person into something, that's a lone weirdo you can ignore. Like, okay, yeah, you play D&D, that's fine. Like, you do you, like, right? But the D&Ders, they all get together. Once you know 2 people into something, it's like, maybe I should pay attention to that, especially if you perceive those 2 people as being independent, like they're not part of the same crew. It's like, somebody else mentions it to you, right? Once you know 3 people, now you have FOMO, like literal, I fear missing out. Like, am I late to this? I better get on it real quick. So I know, I'm having failed so spectacularly at making timing predictions, I feel emboldened now to just double down on my timing predictions. What I think we're coming up to is, obviously there's the US presidential election in 2024. We have US midterm elections here in a couple of months. After the midterm elections, I think it's going to be a lot of attention on the presidential. I don't know yet what other clown world BS will swirl up in the interim to take everybody's attention. But until the presidential election is done with and in the past, I feel like, at least from an American perspective, a lot of psychological energy is going to be tied up in who wins that particular contest. It's kind of like the last democratic institution that matters, right? Everyone's assessment of Congress is super low. Like, nobody approves of what Congress is doing, but at least you feel like you have a vote, or at least people used to feel that way. I don't know if people feel that way anymore, like a vote in the presidential. More and more power seems to be accruing to these non-democratic institutions, these unelected positions, like the Fed, like the what's it called, the Supreme Court. But anyway, so the presidential election, I think, is going to be all hands on deck, and the media is certainly going to pitch it as like the most important vote of our lifetime, which they always say. Until that time, until that's done, Bitcoin has to fight against all that psychic energy that is preventing people from spending time thinking about anything else. Bitcoin's also fighting the psychic energy of people hurting just to pay their bills because of the inflation and because of the interest rates going up and people's assets tanking. So Bitcoin is currently fighting what I believe to be an insurmountable psychic barrier by just all the clown world stuff that's going on. But after the presidential election in 2024, that's when I think we'll have some psychological free up and people can start thinking about this stuff again. And that's when people will be hearing about Bitcoin again, like, oh, wait, that thing didn't die in 2017. Like, that's so weird. I thought that was dead. Like, no, and now it's worth 50,000 or 100,000 or whatever it is. And that's when I think we will have another cycle. But I'm bearish until 2024.
Super cycle,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Oh, so it survived the climate lockdowns of 2023?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, sure. I mean, survival, it's logical in a sense, as far as these things can be. But I think it certainly seems like there's a lot of energy FUD on the horizon, now, especially with the merge having done whatever the fuck it did. There's probably going to be a lot of attention placed on the comparison of the energy use. And yeah, I mean, it seems very much that this is always the case in bear markets, and it's the case until it changes, and it changes very rapidly. But it seems like retail has very much checked out of crypto generally, but certainly Bitcoin. I don't know what like the stats at Swan and River and stuff. I mean, those guys haven't posted their buy side, sell side stuff in a while, but even over the last like 1 to 2 months, I feel like even though like those bag holders that maybe were hanging on and still hoping, I think they're starting to tap out. And this is kind of always the case. And it makes me think that we puke once more down, and then we hang out and grind there for a while, and that just clears out the rest of them. And then we're set to keep going again, whether that's in 23 or 24 or who knows.
Yeah. At the risk of, again, making even more time-based predictions. The end of the year is coming up, the end of the year 2022. And of course, that means that anybody whose assets have depreciated would want to harvest the capital tax loss by selling this year. So expect a lot of selling to be going on of everything, I would guess, coming up the next couple of months. Now we might see some front running of that, but that's my current prediction is like the bottom is going to be December, like Christmas for everybody is. Whether we're talking Bitcoin price, hash miner price, prices of stocks or anything else, I think December is going to be a big rectitude for everybody. Yeah,
I mean, it's hard not to think the macro landscape doesn't have a lot more playing out on the downside too, right? I mean, there's so much crazy stuff going on. I don't think that's played itself out yet, and it seems inevitable that downsides there would affect Bitcoin. So I think and this is how everyone feels now. I mean, I think most consensus is that Bitcoin kind of continues to go lower for a while. But Bitcoin always surprises, it does sometimes what you least expect it to.
Exactly.
So who the fuck really knows?
Yeah, exactly. So back in 2018, I don't think anybody expected it to fall off a cliff at the end of summer from like 6 to 3. Like that took me by surprise. And then I expected in 2021 it to keep going skyrocketing. So now I expect it to fall like 2018, but
who knows?
It's guaranteed not to. But if I expect anything else, then that won't happen either. So
do you think that Bitcoin being the escape hatch, as Lagarde put it, that is the reason why Clown World is accelerating to such an extent that it is because like they have to try and lock in that social credit CBDC system as fast as they can, because the more time they take to implement it, the more time Bitcoin has to sort of succeed and for its educational and UX experience and what have you, for that to improve, the more time they give it.
It's quite possible. Again, like I said before, I'm not sure how much of it would be explicit, like how much they would be intentionally doing it for that reason versus just responding to how rapidly circumstances are shifting and changing as a result of Bitcoin. Bitcoin being the not the bubble but the pin sort of notion that like because that escape hatch is there and because more people are going to take it. And to your point, Jimbo, like the nominal amount of whatever dollars, you're right, stays the same as does Bitcoin as people make those trades, but the purchasing power changes, right? And the amount of the world that each respective system is capable of addressing and is being transacted in is different. And I think our thesis is that eventually the purchasing power of the dollar basically goes to zero, and as a result is not a very useful means of moving through or addressing the world. And in Bitcoin land, it's the exact opposite. And so, I think there's some, I think there's definitely pressure on, and some of it's known by some of those people and some of it's unknown, but I can see that being a catalyst for, trying to push forward these more draconian, or, try to preserve their position more quickly as a result of these developments, for sure.
Yeah, the CBDC thing, to address that part of the question, I really don't think, personally, I really don't think that anybody cares about doing a CBDC, like even the powers that be. And my rationale is that they already have, like, fiat currency is already predominantly digital, right? A relatively small fraction is physical cash, like 3 to maybe 11%. Like that's kind of like the 95% confidence interval. So it's already predominantly digital. It's predominantly digital in a centralized ledger at the central bank, whose name it is to be central. It's administered by a hierarchy of commercial banks that interact with customers on behalf of the central bank. And it's not in anybody's interest to swap out that analog adjudicated hierarchical bureaucracy for a central database system. The only people that benefit from the central database system is, I guess, the few people that have direct control of it. But all of that other architecture just gets obviated. So to go back to Jamie Dimon, like Jamie Dimon doesn't want a CBDC, but Jamie Dimon's the kind of person who would hire the regulators who would push for it when they're done with their public service for a cushy job, sitting there doing nothing at their cubicle all day. Right. And those people need those jobs. Like they're not planning to wreck the whole banking industry, because then where are they going to go after they leave public office? Like,
no, I agree with you. And it's just a question of, will those centralized powers who control does accrue to them via CBDCs, like the ability to turn you off if you use a gas guzzling car or whatever the fuck it is, would they rather would they accept the cannibalization of the commercial industry to consolidate their power and control? And that's an open question. And the other potential reason might be not even so much, because as you say, I mean, everything's digital and tracked and everything now already. Notwithstanding, maybe they have more granular control with CBDC, but everything's pretty fucked already. But might it be a way to do like a bait and switch sleight of hand? So like, hey guys, yes, the currency has basically been destroyed. Wasn't our fault. COVID responses necessary for your best interest. But now we're doing the tech forward thing. We're being, like savvy and innovative, and we're implementing the CBDCs, and it'd be like a new Bretton Woods, but for the 21st century, and be as a means of like relieving themselves of the responsibility for having destroyed the former system. Now that might be a bit of a stretch, but
at the same time, they get to add a carrot, like, I think we should do some sort of universal basic income. You can only redeem it in these tokens. They're safe. You can look at the code, even though that could be changed later. You know what I mean? Where they can impose real negative interest rates or expiry dates, what have you. But initially, they'll be like, here's this new blockchain that everyone's been talking about. We have applied it to our system for your safety, so that we didn't do what we just did. Like, I can see that being a way to sort of wash your hands of what you just did and then just like reincarnate it and do the same thing over again.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess if they wanted to, I don't know that. I mean, I guess if they were going to reboot it, and in some of the documents, so for example, there was a person named Amarova. I don't remember the rest of her name, but she was being suggested for some kind of position. I really don't. I wish I could remember, but I read some of her papers. As the sadist that I am, and one of them was talking about CBDCs and the possibility of delivering aid in that way, and then also directing basically the economy by advocating or reducing the cost of certain transactions and making it harder to perform other transactions, they could control the money supply by giving people two accounts, a savings and a checking, effectively, where the savings account pays interest and the checking account doesn't, and you can only transact out of the checking, and then they can just crank up or down the interest rate on the savings account in order to inspire people to move money or not, right, out in the economy. So that's what these papers were all talking about, was the benefits that accrue to a central control system if you have a CBDC with these properties. So like I said, I mean, people are doing the research. There are people being recommended for positions that might implement these kinds of systems. But at the same time, like in so doing, they obviate a monster bureaucracy of powerful banking interests, to the chagrin of the regulators who would go take jobs with those places after the fact. So as much as that research,
that's why you see people like Kashkari. I don't know if I pronounced his name right. I don't really care either. Him saying that, you know, the CBDC is a commie tool and it has no place in America. Like,
Oh, really? He said that?
Yeah, he did.
Wow.
We've got it on video, which is fantastic. And
Like
the reason I think he's
must be recently.
Yeah, recently. And the best part about that is, John, like, the reason why I think they're taking that stance on it is because, like, they're trying to fight that CBDC takeover. So they can't realistically be implementing the same thing they're sort of fighting and staving off at the same time. But once, like, say the ECB CBDC attempt fails, and once that offshore dollar market completely crushes and, you know, Davos is defeated, what have you, then maybe they may change their tune about it. But right now, at least we've bought some time.
Yeah. Central banking is communist. Like, it's in the Communist Manifesto, like command of the banking
Fifth
system.
commandment.
Yeah. Central bank digital currency is more communist. It's like doubling down because it provides even more central control over the behavior of the subjects of the state. So,
but
I guess
that's almost an argument in favor, because these people fundamentally, you know, many of them would, you know, they, again, not explicitly, but in their actions align quite closely, it would seem, with the tenets of communism.
Yeah, I mean, communism makes sense if you can be in the elite privileged group of people in command of those forces. But if you're looking from the outside in, it looks a whole lot less appealing. And so that's why I think even people like Kashkari. I love how his name is like literally Neil, like kneeling, Kashkari. Like that's his actual name. Like it's almost like the simulation winking at us. Like, you know, like I'll give you a clue.
There's a lot of winks these days, I'm finding.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, if he calls it out as a commie tool, he's not wrong. And maybe from his perspective, I mean, what are his motivations? Like is he likely to be in charge of the CBDC, or is he likely to get the boot with the rest of the bureaucracy, with the Jamie Dimons and the rest? So I don't know.
I think, like we were saying before, the options, it could very well be the case that the options being presented to whoever, you know, the decision makers in this regard are not great. It's like, do you want to cannibalize this group of people or these interests and whatever, or do you want to be cannibalized by this? And so, you know, maybe it's not a great, it's like, you want to lose dollar hegemony to something like Bitcoin in the next 5 years, or do you want to maybe preserve it for another 10? You got to give up the commercial banking system, though. You know, they're both shitty options if you're the existing, you know, monetary power, but maybe those are the only options available to you.
True. And then if that's the case and you have a lose-lose situation, either lose in 5 years or lose in 10 years or somewhere around those ballparks, it's like, when did they start aping in themselves? And also, like, what extent do we have rehypothecation to this day in terms of like exchanges selling more than they realistically do have? And have you guys had, sorry, 3 questions, but have you guys at CT talked about like proof of reserves and those kind of things?
I'm sure we've talked about it. I mean, I want to be careful not to say something I'm not supposed to, but I'm sure we've talked about it. I mean, we don't sell Bitcoin or do anything like that, right? There's just Bitcoin on the balance sheet, which everybody knows about. But I see this is one of the things that I have some concern about too. And again, like I've already accepted that education is basically rectucation. Like pain is the best educator, and that's just the way it is. So I don't moan about it too much. But so much Bitcoin is held by exchanges. So to your point, and all the things that can happen there, so much Bitcoin is paper Bitcoin, custody by GBTC, ETFs, all this kind of stuff. And if we're at all correct in the thesis that there's going to be pushback on this at some point, all that shit is a phone call away from being taken from whoever thinks they own it. And that's just it. And when we're talking about effectively millions of Bitcoin that fall into that category, again, it doesn't stop Bitcoin, doesn't, like, the long-term thing is still intact, but it would put a really bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. And again, maybe that would backfire and it'd be a good thing, because it would make so evident how egregious, the measures taken by who's ever on the other end of that phone are. But it may very well be the case that a lot of people get burned as a result of that. So I'm not a cheerleader for ETF approval or any of this kind of stuff, because I don't think that's good. Like it sure, it brings liquidity and it pumps the bags of people that hold Bitcoin, but most people that take advantage of those instruments, they're never going to make the switch. Again, this is the point we were talking about responsibility before. Like they think, oh, hey, I've gotten exposure now to this exciting new asset. I'm good. Because some people would argue like, oh, well, they're just, they're not too tech savvy. They're going to get the ETF exposure, and over the course of time, they'll become more comfortable with self-custody. Maybe true for some. I don't think for most. Most people's mentality works like, okay, I'm good. I got it. Somebody else is taking care of it. I don't have to worry about it. And I have some exposure to the upside. And if a huge amount, because it already is a huge amount, but if even more gets sucked into that domain, well, then you have all the problems with paper Bitcoin, and then you have all the custodial risk. And then, it could be a really bad circumstance if a 3-letter agency just wants to pick up the phone one day. And so there's nothing I can do about it, but other than promote self-custody and all the benefits that entails. But I'm not a cheerleader for the ETFs and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, the ETF approval would be in my own financial best interest, so I will hope that occurs. But that's because I was stupid. So I had a 401k, like a lot of people, and the only way that I could convert that into Bitcoin custody, I say the only way, the least difficult way was for me to just ape into GBTC with my entire 401k at significant premiums, and now we're at a significant discount. Like I'm down in fiat terms and Bitcoin terms. It's like so much. Like, and at the time, my rationale was like, well, if I take it out of my 401k, I have to pay a penalty plus taxes, plus they're not even going to give it to me until I can demonstrate financial need, which is its own struggle. To like document why I need my fucking money, So I was like, all right, fine, I'll just ape into GBTC, and now I'm down a whole bunch. So if this can be a lesson to anybody, like, do not buy GBTC. It has already failed. It has already failed. It's down because it was at a premium of 20%. Now it's at a discount of 30%. It's down 50% in Bitcoin terms. Like it has already failed. Like, yeah, so we don't need to wait. Like, it's
Speaking of
now.
Things that have already failed, Jimbo, isn't it funny how like we're talking about either CBDCs or the collapse of fiat, and people are thinking that gold is an option.
Oh.
Gold has already failed.
Yeah,
for so many reasons that I don't even think I need to paraphrase.
But before we break into that one, because it's an interesting one, I don't want to talk about it. I'd love to do you guys think, what's your opinion on paper Bitcoin products and ETFs and stuff? Because like mine is somewhat radical, where I think all of that is bad for Bitcoin, even though, it might pump my bags. I may not be thinking about it properly. So I'd love to get you guys' opinion on the validity of those instruments.
I guess I don't understand the question about them being good or bad, because I often, as a personality flaw, I get hung up on good, bad questions because like they exist, you know? Is it better or worse that they exist? It's hard to say because history is path dependent. We live in the present where they did exist. So I would be guessing about an alternative branch of the sim where they didn't. So I don't know.
My view on it, John, is that, you know, it isn't great in the sense that people aren't taking on the responsibility and accountability, as you kind of said. But hold on, my dog's being whiny. Shush. But what you also said was that like sometimes the best lesson is, you know, is pain. And so if you believe that the best lesson is pain and that someone's going to eventually call and highlight that pain, then it's kind of contradictory to say that it's a bad thing, because it'll teach more people and, you know, simultaneously pump bags for a small amount of people in the interim. I think that people getting burnt isn't going to be great, but it'll inevitably lead to highlight the importance of self-custody, which is the point of bearer assets in the first place. So do I think, you know, people having learned that lesson is a good thing? Yeah, I do.
And
do I
part of
think
that is like,
having
can
that
they?
lesson on a great scale is a good thing? Sure, it is. Is people getting burnt a good thing? No. Like that part obviously sucks.
Yeah.
But it's
I guess
hand in hand.
the other suck part of that is whoever the monopoly on force is having, you know, potentially being able to get their hands on all that Bitcoin as well, far more easily. And that's part of the calculus perhaps. But no, I take that point, and if pain is the exclusive way that the vast majority of people are going to learn, then as you say, maybe you should, and Jimbo, to answer your question, maybe bad or good is the wrong framing. An outcome that you would prefer or not prefer to see, and therefore one that you would promote or not promote.
Oh,
So
from where we are now? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, from Kiwi's perspective, like maybe maybe the thing to do is promote the shit out of all this stuff so people can get, you know, the pain over with as fast as possible. Now, because, you know, I think a lot of people will not learn unless it's by a painful experience. I mean, that's just unfortunately the case for a lot of things, learning the hard way.
I guess in that case, if we're like judging what we think future outcomes would be, I think the approval of an ETF would hurt more people over a longer period of time than if the SEC continues to drag their feet forever and doesn't approve one. Because the longer that there's no actual ETF, the more there's a spread between these like traded products in Bitcoin, and people aren't mistakenly thinking that they're getting Bitcoin price exposure, because it's like, why is it different? Why is GBTC $11 and Bitcoin's 18,000? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, I want that cognitive dissonance to persist as long as possible so that more people don't get wrecked like me and just take their money out of their 401k Ponzi scam and put it into actual Bitcoin.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right. So the gold question.
Yeah. Funny quick story about that. This is years ago, gosh, like probably 5 years ago. I just offhandedly mentioned Nixon taking us off the gold standard in a work meeting. And one of my colleagues is like, wait, the dollar's not backed by gold? I was like, no, it hasn't been for 50 years. Like, look into it. So people just don't even have any idea.
I'm always surprised that people even like knew that it was, but somehow didn't know that now it's not for the last 50 years. You know, like in what capacity, in what circumstance would they have gotten that information? That's like, they would have gotten information that was so old and not have been updated, you know, for the last 50 years.
Yeah. So I mean, my take on the gold thing is that gold, so rock lost to paper like hundreds of years ago, right? Gold could not keep up with the telecommunications advances of the 19th century. So when we had railroads and like telegraphs, and people could conduct business from, you know, East Coast to West Coast, gold as a settlement vehicle was no longer viable. And so everybody put their gold in the bank and traded bank notes or checks. So gold was already dead during, in my opinion, this is my opinion, gold was already dead during the period of the gold standard. The fact that we have to talk about the standard, that it was a standard, that standards were employed, shows that gold was not money. Otherwise, we just would have called it regular gold. But no, there was a standard, and people currencies were exchangeable for gold, that to me was already the failure. It was already dead that long ago. So anybody who wants us to go back to a gold standard, I think, is missing the boat, because you can't send gold through the internet. There's just no way. It's a physical thing, so it has no chance of resurrection, in my opinion.
Yeah,
Well,
it's too
Jimbo.
expensive to send. It's too expensive to store. It's too expensive to have personally, because you can't send it away at a zip at a time. It failed for those reasons. That's like, it's in terms of like spatio-temporal, the temporal aspect of that, it sucks. It's not portable. It's hard to verify its authenticity. And so for that reason, that's why paper was introduced, to help with that portability and divisibility. So like, that's already a failed system. And if you're talking about, the upcoming debt jubilee or CBDC system, you have the continuation of fiat, already failed, metal or Bitcoin. Like, those are the three options you get to choose, or some, monkey JPEGs, but that's about it.
Yeah, I mean, clearly you Luddites haven't heard about gold-backed cryptos, because that is obviously the solution to the problems that you just referred to.
God, so no, please, like, the word "backed" there is really, it's so crucial. People talk about like using blockchain for something, and they'll say, oh, it's going to be gold backed, or real estate backed. It's like, the fact that you're using the word backed means you've already failed. The thing about Bitcoin is, it is the thing itself. Like, those digits, people say, oh, Bitcoin's not backed. Like, yes, exactly. What you're getting is a number in a database, and that number is all there is. There's no backer who can turn around and then not honor that. There's not debt. It's just a thing that you have exclusively in your head. Anyway, yeah, the whole backed thing. Yeah, please.
Peterson covered that well. It was like, the map is the territory.
Yeah, he caught on to a few Bitcoin concepts quite quickly when we spoke to him. I don't know, over a year ago. I didn't catch it at the time, but in listening back, I was pretty impressed in some respects. But he's an interesting case as well, because he's obviously a powerhouse intellect in many regards, at least in my opinion. And but there's I think he has like a, it's too good to be true sort of attitude to it. Like, I don't think he's also not, I mean, he claims not to be very well versed in economics and stuff, but I think his thinking about value generally puts him in the upper echelon of being able to think about economics anyway. So I don't really take that take that kind of like excuse for him. I think his major hang up is it's a little too good to be true, and therefore I'm not going to allow myself to believe that it is, which, fair enough. I mean, at a certain point, you kind of have to determine for yourself, or decide for yourself, like, am I going to act? And this is really interesting, because like, am I going to act as though this is what I think it is? Am I going to act as though this is true? And you kind of have to make that choice. And interestingly enough, that's his refrain when he's asked the "Do you believe in God?" question. And people always think it's some kind of a cop out, like, oh, like, why don't you just say yes or no? What is, I act as though he or it exists? Like, what does that mean? And I think it means something like this. It's like, you can't know for sure, but how are you going to act, and how are you going to orient your behavior? I'm going to do so in reference to acting as though what I think is true or right or good or whatever is those things. And because who knows if they are or not, but I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to observe what manifests in my life as a result. And, that's kind of the process of living and engaging in belief and the feedback that it generates. But I don't know what point I was trying to make there. So
I'm not sure if like the analogy is necessarily the best fit, because like, it's not necessarily belief when it comes to Bitcoin, in the sense that you run the numbers, like, and what he's kind of in a roundabout saying is he doesn't want to give himself hope, but it's like, you can verify, its authenticity, and
yeah,
the rule.
You can verify certain aspects of it, but you don't know for sure that it will always be there tomorrow, right? Like, you don't know for 100% its permanence is I guess is part of the the leap of faith aspect.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk about that. And this seems like it might be the right forum. I've been trying to come up with a way to frame and explain the ways of knowing, because people like, we say don't trust, verify, right? But it's a little bit more complex than that, because there are things you can verify and things you can't. So the way that I've been framing it, and I welcome discussion. Let me just explain the frame and then I'll stop talking. Is the way I've been framing it is there are 4 ways to know something. The first way is lived experience, like you did it yourself. They'd be like rolling your own dice for a seed, right? Second way of knowing something is you replicate a result. So maybe you don't trust the machine, but it's a black box or something, but you run it multiple times, or maybe you run a different machine that's supposed to produce the same result and it gives you the same answer. This would be like generating an XPub from a seed, right? I don't know whether my hardware wallet is lying to me. Are those really my addresses? But if I put the same seed in a different manufacturer's wallet, does it give me the same answer? Okay, now I have some what's the word? Some expectation of it being true. So you can do it yourself, experience it directly. You can replicate a result using unreliable means. The third way is to audit. So audit would be like, I read the source code and it looks good to me, so I understand what it's doing. To me, that's not as good, but it's something. And then the fourth way is to delegate. You just expect somebody else to do it for you. And so what science should be, science has lost a lot of its meaning, but what science should be is that replication part, right? You have a hypothesis, you do it yourself. Somebody else says, well, I don't know about that. So they replicate it using different tools. They replicate whatever your hypothesis is, and they either can produce it or they can't. Other people, then you get these published results and people audit that and they say, okay, yeah, it looks like they did it right. And then everybody else delegates to the scientific community, like, okay, well, whatever you say is good enough for us, right? Those are this is examples of the real life of these 4 different ways. So to Jordan Peterson's, situation, it's like, yeah, you might not have the technical acumen to do the audit. And so you might delegate the audit to coders who can do that. But you can still replicate a result. You can still, do something multiple times yourself and confirm that it produces the same outcome. Or you can do it yourself if you do have that technical acumen. So these are, anyway, that's my framework. Last time repeating, experience, replication, audit, delegation are the 4 ways of knowing.
No, I don't take any issue with that. I think the broader point that I was trying to make is not that the system itself is not auditable or verifiable, but just you knowing not only its permanence and that'll be here tomorrow, but like you knowing that the logical framework that you've applied and which has caused you to value this thing is accurate or is true or will hold up over the course of time. Like hypothetical, right? Bitcoin gets, fudded insanely. ETH gets the support of everything else. Market cap of ETH is double. The narrative, around ETH is whatever. And so because value is such a funny thing, like it is a decision, right? The Bitcoin is what it is because not only, yes, because it's a verifiable truth. And I think a lot of value accrues to it because you could make the case that it is the most intersubjective, immutable truth that we have available to us. But that still doesn't mean that it's necessarily absolute. We're all acting as though that is the case, and therefore that partially makes it the case. Maybe our logical frameworks, our value frameworks, something changes in the future. And I'm not making this case, by the way, because I think Bitcoin is actually fundamentally grounded in something metaphysical or metaphysical principles even. But my broader point is that, certainty at a certain level is necessarily elusive. If you expand out the domains of potential action, at some point you're going to reach a domain where you lack certainty. So maybe within the protocol, you can verify and you can audit. But as you move out, you get more uncertainty. So like on a galactic level, just to be super absurd here, if the Milky Way galaxy, gets sucked in by a supermassive black hole that gets introduced through a wormhole or whatever in the next whatever period of time, and everything in with it gets consumed, well, then Bitcoin wasn't absolute, wasn't permanent, and therefore it kind of proves the point that your relationship to it, at least in part, was constituted by an acting as though it were true enough and permanent enough and certain enough to orient your behavior. That may have been a bit squishy, but do you kind of know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, it's a consequence of life that we never have all the information, and
Right.
yet we have to act, right? There's always more information that would make your ability to decide better,
Right.
that you wish you knew, and you can't know, and you have to act anyway. I mean, it seems to be a fundamental paradox of existence. And
Well,
so
that's what an axiom is, right? You're saying I'm going to hold this as true in order to make logical deductions or to orient my behavior, et cetera. And so I think maybe that makes the point, right? We don't ever have full knowledge and therefore not full certainty, but we still have to act. So in relation to everything, we have to act as though things are true. And that constitutes all of our decision-making effectively once you boil it all down. And so I think that's the case in relation to Bitcoin. I think that's the case in relation to God. And those are two big ones, but maybe you apply it to absolutely everything.
And then juxtapose that to the alternatives, because you're going to have to act either way. One, you think probabilistically is the truth and the right direction. And the other, for sure, is the wrong direction, manipulated and disregard for consent. So either way, you're going to have to act. So I don't understand his hesitancy there. Do you think, though, that him...
Oh, that's a very good point. Yeah.
Do you think that he and Pierre Polivier, is that how I pronounce it, are going to be a Bitcoin sort of powerhouse duo between the two of them?
Not really.
No.
I think Pierre's taken a lot of heat for his Bitcoin comments. So I think he's probably going to dial it back a little bit. You know, if he becomes the leader, maybe he'll ratchet it up again. And at a minimum, I think he won't impose arbitrary government restrictions. But again, who the hell knows? I mean, I think he's the best option that's currently available, but trusting politicians is, not something that you want to engage in, really. And I think, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me to see how it plays out with Peterson, because, I think Bitcoin is the most intellectually stimulating, relevant, meaningful, consequential thing in the world today that bleeds in and has relevance in so many of these other domains of thought and discourse, whether it be philosophy or theology and energy and science and mathematics and economics and human action and all this kind of stuff. And that's what most of his conversations are fundamentally about. And the real elephant in the room, or the lack of the elephant, the thing that's missing in those conversations from my perspective, and I'll fully admit I'm a, crazy Bitcoiner, is Bitcoin. And so I don't know if that eventually clicks for him and it becomes part of the thing. But also I think, my assertion is that Bitcoin may be the very thing, or at least something close to the thing that he's most, in his dialogues, he's most trying to converge on. Like what Bitcoin is what he's often, and his cohorts are often talking about. And that's partially why I think it's a much bigger step for him to believe or recognize that Bitcoin is that thing, because I think, maybe, I don't know, it would be such a big deal. Like, what are the consequences of belief? And I think we as Bitcoiners are partially examples of that, because we've already discussed how, like, once you go down the rabbit hole and your perspective starts shifting, well, that transforms you. That transforms your behavior, your character, who you fundamentally are. So, like, belief is a very powerful thing, and you want to be careful how you engage it. And I think he recognizes that. And as a result, I think there's a lot of trepidation. And it's not just trepidation, because I don't think he sees it fully for what it is yet. But to the extent that he does, I think there's trepidation of being careful, to believe in something so profound for what the consequences of doing so would be.
Do you think that hesitancy is fear of being ostracized? Because that isn't exactly prevalent in a lot of the work he does in other regards to, like...
What's not prevalent?
Well, he has no fear of discussing controversial topics.
Yeah, no, I don't think he's afraid of being ostracized. No.
Well, given that, and given that he has to act, and one's, funding the guards, the jailers, like what he already talked about Trudeau and the vaccine mandates and the rest of it. Well, what do you think funds that, Jordan?
Good question. I think, maybe.
So you don't want to have hope. You'd rather just perpetually fund something you despise. Like that makes no logical sense either.
I think there's at least two things going on, and likely much more. But one, he has, and to give the devil its due, he has, I think, a rightful respect for certain elements of how, because like the world is super fucked, right? But it's not beyond redemption. It's not like there's not good and great things about it. It's not like modernity hasn't produced things that we might all agree are good. We want to revamp them, we want to add to them, we want to subtract, but like, and I'm the first to like ask the question, what does progress really mean? And if you look at the chronology of history, I enjoy engaging in the discussions which are based on the premise it's not a straight line of progress. I think we could look at times past, even several thousand years in the past, and we could say there are elements of that society when compared to the element of global society today that are way more desirable, and that's my personal opinion, and that's another discussion. But in his criticisms, he's always careful not to overly criticize the institutions of society, because he recognizes, I think, the danger of taking an approach that it all needs to be burnt to the ground. And I think so for that reason, he's reticent to be too critical of some of the things that you maybe just mentioned. I also maybe think he doesn't see the straight line, between the two all the time. Maybe the connection between fraudulent money and lockdowns and bureaucracies and all the other crazy shit he rails against. Maybe he doesn't perceive or believe in the type of straight line that we might see. And then, like us all, blind spots and cognitive dissonance, right? I mean, we all have them, and the reason why we have them is because we can't see them. And even as much of an intellect that he has, I don't think he falls prey to that as well. He's not excluded from that pitfall, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's totally reasonable to be skeptical. I think he's skeptical, which is reasonable. Like everybody's skeptical. First time you hear about Bitcoin, you're like, that sounds like a scam. Like that's a totally reasonable response. It just takes time. I have been surprised at how many people I thought, like how many intellectuals I liked and thought were smart. And then Satoshi's razor comes along and then they just don't get it. And then it's like, okay, well, like
that's the first time I've heard Satoshi's razor.
Well, I guess I was wrong. I mean, examples like Taleb, right? Taleb even wrote the preface to Safe's book, and then he just he just fell off a cliff. But another example would be I don't know if you know this person, Clay Shirky. Is that a name? You recognize? So Clay Shirky wrote a couple of books that were popular a while back. Well, I mean, popular in the circles that I was in. I think one, I forget what they were called now, but he was a really big advocate of technology, and particularly things like Wikipedia. And he was talking about how Wikipedia really changed, how was it that Wikipedia was able to be successful at providing all this information? Because you have to remember, for however bad Wikipedia is now, it's still way, way better than all of the encyclopedias, the private encyclopedias that existed before Wikipedia. And how did that come to be? Because it was just people making regular contributions. And the answer is that Wikipedia makes it easy to undo vandalism. So you can go into a Wikipedia article, you write whatever you want, but anybody else can come along and just say, nope, revert. Like they can just undo whatever horrible thing you put on this website. So by making an easy to apply undo button, Wikipedia became a better encyclopedia than all that had preceded it on an open platform. So Clay Shirky made this observation. I think he was totally right. clearly he understands the nature of decentralized systems. He speaks well about Linux and about how Linux defeated Microsoft, at least in some areas, some arenas, by taking contributions that Microsoft could never have access to, because Microsoft only takes contributions from people it pays. And Linux is like anybody can come along and just make one change, and here you go. Now it's part of the system. So he had this good framework for understanding the value of Wikipedia and Linux and these systems that are valuable because they have contributions from all kinds of people. And yet he doesn't get Bitcoin, right? Satoshi's razor, guy doesn't get it. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess he wasn't as smart as I thought. So here with Jordan Peterson, as long as Jordan Peterson isn't railing against Bitcoin, I guess I'll continue to give him some time, right? And it's totally reasonable, again, to be skeptical. And especially if he's not already versed in things like money. If he spent his entire career thinking about non-monetary ethics issues, then I can understand why that might be a hole that he doesn't have a lot of experience in. That's fine. But anyway, I hope he comes around. One person I was super excited to see come around was what's his name? Jeff, author of The Price of Tomorrow. Jeff
Booth.
Jeff Booth, yeah. So he came up with Price of Tomorrow. I heard about the book. I saw him speak like TED Talks and whatnot. I'm like, now here's a guy who should really understand Bitcoin and who should appreciate the fact that having a money that's not controlled by a small cabal of elites to, cantillionaire themselves into oblivion, like this is a guy that should get it. And then he got it. And I was like, yes, like, thank you, one person, but yes, so far the record has not been great.
Jeff is awesome. And one of the things that I think gets in especially the well-known academics or intellectuals way is ego. So often if you hang your hat on being an intellectual and something comes up that is, extremely relevant and, people are talking about it and you don't really get it, the easiest thing to do is dismiss it as not being as relevant as you're being told and say like, this is, because you don't even want to tell yourself, like you would have known about something and you would know about something that's so consequential, and that you don't and to protect your ego, you dismiss it. And Jeff is a prime example because he's a super humble dude. He's a super humble, super nice guy. And I think Peterson, despite his insane fame and growing fortune, and you can imagine how much that would play on an ego and how much it might pump you up and manipulate you, I think he does a pretty good job at remaining humble and trying to not fall prey to that sort of mentality as a result of the fame and an intellectual notoriety and all that kind of stuff. But I think one of the interesting or important questions for us is, what is the litmus test that we are looking for from such people? Like we referred to purity tests right at the beginning of this thing, but like, what characterizes a card carrying Bitcoiner? Like, so Peterson, we know Peterson owns Bitcoin. He said that before, probably through, I don't know if it's custody or not, who knows, but he owns it. He agrees that it's a good thing. He's glad it exists. He thinks it's promising. He's just not willing to say, I've accepted Bitcoin as my Lord and Savior yet. And so what are we looking for in these, famous people out in the world that we're hoping grok it? Like, what are we looking for from them? Are we looking to invite their intellect in and we want them to really get it so they can contribute to the discourse? Or are we looking for them to say, you know what, separating money and state is the most important thing. We've been, on the plantation, slaves on the plantation for too long. This is an injustice and Bitcoin fixes this. Like, what is it that we're looking for people, to become a Bitcoiner?
From intellectuals, what you're wanting is just objective journalism and being humble, like being able to say I was wrong. In terms of being like an actual Bitcoiner, in my sort of definition, is you have to self-custody and run a node. Otherwise, you're trusting and not verifying. And that's what led us to the issues that we're trying to escape from. So in order to actually use the system and be a Bitcoiner rather than be a Bitcoin user, you need to actually run the numbers and verify things. Like otherwise you're trusting, and that leads down a slippery path. That's how I sort of perceive it. But it's kind of interesting watching the Bitcoin derangement syndrome from the intellectuals that come in and try fix it from an early, shallow look into it. But like, if you have the ability, like Jeff Booth, be like, oh, I was wrong, or be humble and be like objective about what you're seeing rather than trying to make it about you, like that's all you're looking for from an intellectual. Rather, like I don't want to hear about string theory or what have you. I just want you to make it like easy layman terms. This is your understanding. This is why, and be flexible on those for pushback if someone goes, no, you're wrong, and here's why, and be like, okay, that makes more sense, and then update your thesis. Like that's all you're looking for from intellectuals. Like listening to people like Naval and Talib and stuff was frustrating to say the least.
I think it was gauge theory. I think that was the reference to Weinstein that you may have just made. But no, I agree. I mean, like, what are you most fundamentally subordinating yourself? The truth or your conception of yourself and how people think of you in a certain realm? And I think the ones that fall into the former category, humility is an outcome of that. And as a result, you put yourself in a better position to acquire more knowledge fundamentally and probably get along with those others that are doing the same better. And it's evident, right? I mean, we see this all the time. This is why, Bitcoin, from the perspective of those people that come in with an ego, they characterize Bitcoiners as being toxic and mean and all this kind of stuff. And for the people that are humble and wanting to learn and not, trying to assert their reputation or anything, their accolades or appeals to authority or credibility or whatever, then they enjoy it. They're like, wow, what a stimulating environment for having rigorous conversations and debates and questions about all of these, super relevant issues. And like, wow, how awesome. And I love that people are passionate about it. And I love that people feel like they, there's no PC, there's no taboo. Like you can get on how you like and you sink or swim based on how you do that. Like, wow, how refreshing. That's such a departure from, the normal society as it is today.
Yeah, it's literally just applying the scientific method. Like, here's my hypothesis. Here's why I believe it's correct. And then, reality slaps you in the face. No, that was incorrect. Here's why. And then just like updating your model. Like, that's all you can expect from any intellectual or scientist. But that seems to be, quite missing in today's clown world.
Yeah. What I want is like, first of all, I just want to say I'm totally cool with ignorance. Like everyone starts out ignorant on every topic, like ever, right? Ignorance is the default state that you should be in most of the time. And then you learn something, and then now you're not as ignorant anymore. So I'm totally cool with ignorance, and I would love to see them admit ignorance when they don't know. And I think Peterson's doing that just fine. Like he's like, I don't know, like it seems cool. I don't know. Like that's fine. Like love it, wonderful. If you're going to be confident, though, then you have to know. And that's all I want is like, so I want intellectuals to understand. I want them to have done the thinking to arrive at the fact that like money is the problem. Like the fiat currency is the problem. It is upstream of all other political discussion until, and as long as the state can issue as much currency as it wants, any other political discussion is irrelevant. It just doesn't matter because the state can always just spend to do whatever it wants to do. It backstabs Republicans who think they're fiscal conservatives every time they're in office, every single time since Reagan or before. And of course, Blue Team has no illusions about not wanting to spend money. That's all they want to do is spend money all the time. So until and unless you separate money and state, all other political discussion is a waste of time. I want intellectuals to acknowledge that. If you're going to be confident, I want you to acknowledge that. Then that's A. And then part B is, okay, so then how do you separate money and state? What technologies are possibly able to affect that transition? Because we're not going to be able to do it by voting, as evidenced by every election ever. So what technologies are available? And if you admit the technologies are available, then it's like, okay, now if you're so convinced that it's not Bitcoin, explain to me why. Like if you think, people, I hear people all the time like, oh yeah, the government will shut it down. It's like, how? Like, explain to me how. The government is not all powerful. They don't have infinite resources. They have to make decisions about what they want to do at the expense of other things that is the opportunity cost that they're not going to do. So anyway, that's what I want from intellectuals. It's like either, to your point, be humble, like be humbly ignorant. Humble ignorance is great. Like I will take humble ignorance all day long. I'm humbly ignorant about all kinds of stuff. I was wrong about the super cycle. So far. We'll see. Humble ignorance is fine. Confident ignorance is what really grinds my gears. It's like if you're going to be confident, at least know what you're talking about.
Yeah, agreed. Confident ignorance is the worst. gents, have we not touched on something we want to touch on before we shut it down, or are we good? We've been going for almost 3 hours.
I think we're good. What do you reckon, Jimbo?
I'll apologize for being late. I'm sorry. I didn't, I must
Oh,
have
we
missed
thought
the
we-
invite or something. Yeah.
We thought you were going to be, no, I didn't send an invite. I said I'd
Oh,
send
okay.
the link on the Twitter chat beforehand. But when we first started, I thought you were going to be much later. I was great because Kiwi said you might be like 40 minutes late, but you hopped in pretty much right at the beginning. So
Oh yeah, I had a work
All worked
meeting,
out.
but it's one of those like whole bunch of people called in, so I just kind of like quietly dropped off, and it was all right.
And
Nobody
you know,
noticed.
priorities.
Yeah,
nice.
priorities.
Priorities. All right, well, guys, I appreciate you, putting up your hand to do this, and I knew it'd be fun just hanging out and shooting the shit, and it was. So appreciate the time, and whether I see you at a conference or we do this again sometime in the future, like, let's keep in touch, and hope everything is good for you guys.
Sounds good, John. Thanks for having us. Appreciate your work, man.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, see you guys. Take care.